were written in stone, there were places that lived only in memory, cities that rose and fell like breath itself. Some were built of stone, some of story, some of quiet dreams passed from one voice to another. Tonight we'll wander through cities like Atlantis, Pompeii, and Machu Picchu, not as tourists, but as quiet witnesses, listening as their stories fade into sleep. Chapter 1: Atlantis. A name that refuses to stay buried. More than 2,000 years ago, Plato described a civilization beyond imagination, a glittering island empire rising from the sea like a crown of bronze and gold. Vast canals feed crystal harbors, temples crowned with marble columns catching fire in the sun. This was not just a city, this was a world power. Bull-leaping arenas alive with cheers, gardens blooming exotic fruits under perpetual mist, their navy unmatched, their engineers tamming the ocean itself. But beneath the grandeur, ordinary lives pulsed. Fishermen mending nets at dawn by the central harbor, children chasing bronze toys through shaded colonnades, a merchant tallying ivory from distant shores, unaware his ledgers would sink forever, priests in white robes preparing evening rituals, warriors drilling in sunlit squares. These weren't gods, they breathed, they laughed, they lived. According to Plato, Atlantis was an ideal world, until it wasn't. He said the island fell not because of nature, but because its people grew greedy. They forgot balance. They forgot humility. They believed themselves untouchable. And then came the final night. Twilight paints the canals deep red. Torches flicker alive along the outer rings. Merchants shutter their stalls. A mother tucks her child beneath woven blankets, humming an ancient lullaby. In the royal palace, priests burn incense before golden statues. Laughter spills from tavernas where sailors boast of voyages. Stars emerge sharp in the darkening sky. Then a tremor, distant, soft. Waves slap higher against the marble walls. The earth groans. Water surges. In a single day and night, the sea rose, and Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves. Gone. No ruins rising from the ocean. No confirmed location, only fragments. For centuries, explorers have searched. Some believe it was Santorini, destroyed by volcanic fury. Others point to submerged formations off the Bahamas, circular ruins matching Plato's geometry. Still others see it as metaphor, a warning whispered across time. Today, Atlantis lives in myths, in maps, in imagination, a sunken dream that refuses to die. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Perhaps it was meant to be remembered. As a reminder that, when we believe we are untouchable, the world has a way of proving otherwise. The waves took everything back, and now those waves carry us forward, deeper into history, toward the next lost city waiting in shadow. Chapter 2: Mohenjo-Daro. Mound of the Dead. That's what the name means in Sindhi. And when archaeologists first saw it in the 1920s, that's what it looked like. A mound of baked brick rising from the Indus River floodplain in Pakistan. But beneath that mound lay one of the world's oldest cities, a contemporary of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, a city from 2500 BC with urban planning so advanced it wouldn't be matched for 3,000 years. Mohenjo-Daro was a major city of the Indus Valley civilization, the same culture that built Harappa. When excavations began in the 1920s, what emerged astonished the archaeological world. The city was laid out on a precise grid. Streets ran north-south and east-west, intersecting at right angles. Main streets were 30 feet wide. Houses were built from standardized baked bricks, a ratio of 4:1, used across the entire civilization. But the most impressive feature was the plumbing. Nearly every house had a private bathroom with a drain. Wastewater flowed through covered drains under the streets, with manholes for maintenance. This level of sanitation was extraordinary. Rome wouldn't match it for 2,000 years. The Great Bath is the most famous structure, a pool roughly 40 feet long, 8 feet deep, sealed with bitumen. Steps led down both sides. Small rooms surrounded it. The entire complex suggests ritual bathing, which remains important in Hindu and Buddhist traditions today. Life in Mohenjo-Daro around 2000 BC was urban and comfortable. The population may have reached 40,000. People lived in multi-story houses with private bathrooms. They drew water from over 700 wells throughout the city. They used standardized weights and measures for trade. Craftsmen produced distinctive red pottery with black designs. They created jewelry from carnelian, lapis, and gold. They carved intricate seals showing bulls and unicorns, with short inscriptions in the undeciphered Indus script. These seals were found as far away as Mesopotamia, evidence of long-distance trade. A famous bronze figurine called the Dancing Girl shows a young woman with bangles covering her arm, one hand on her hip in a confident pose. Children played with toy carts, clay animals, and bird-shaped whistles. The city had no obvious temples or palaces, no monumental statues of kings, no rich burials. This suggests a more egalitarian society, or one where displays of individual power weren't culturally important. Around 1900 BC, things changed. The Indus River shifted course. Floods became more frequent. Climate change weakened the monsoons. Agriculture grew difficult. By 1700 BC, Mohenjo-Daro was in decline. People moved east toward the Ganges Valley, where water was reliable. The great urban centers emptied over generations. For years, scholars believed in a dramatic end, an Aryan invasion with massacres. But modern analysis debunks this. The city was gradually abandoned as environmental conditions worsened. Mohenjo-Daro became ruins. Floods covered parts, wind exposed others. The site became a mound that locals called Mound of the Dead, unaware of what lay beneath. When excavated, archaeologists found a major problem: salt. Rising water tables brought salt through the bricks, crystallizing and breaking them apart. Despite conservation efforts, salt damage continues. The site is UNESCO listed but in danger. Today you can walk streets where merchants once haggled, stand in the Great Bath, see wells that provided water to families whose names we'll never learn. Mohenjo-Daro reminds us that sophisticated civilization is older than we assume, that sanitation and urban planning deeply matter, that we're still learning. The Indus script might someday be deciphered or remain forever mysterious. And it reminds us that cities can die slowly, not in flames, but through environmental change that makes life incrementally harder until the last family leaves. The bricks remain, the wells still hold water, the drains still function though empty, and we walk through silence trying to imagine voices. As wind blows across ancient streets and peacocks call from distant fields, we leave the Indus Valley behind and journey west across the Pacific, toward the Maya heartland, toward a city of carved glyphs and royal tombs, toward Palenque. Chapter 3: Palenque. In the jungles of Chiapas, Mexico, Maya temples rise from the forest, their pyramids draped in vines, their walls covered in intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions. This was one of the Maya world's most powerful city-states, reaching its peak in the 7th century AD under Kitezh Pakal the Great. When archaeologists opened his tomb in 1952, they found a carved slab that sparked wild speculation. Some claimed he was an ancient astronaut piloting a spacecraft. He wasn't, but the real story is more fascinating than fiction. Pakal became king in 615 AD at age 12. He would rule for 68 years, extraordinary for any era. Under him, Palenque became an architectural and artistic center. He commissioned the Temple of the Inscriptions where he'd be buried. He rebuilt the palace complex. He defeated rival cities. Most importantly, he left records, carved in stone, written in Maya hieroglyphs that have been largely deciphered. The Temple of the Inscriptions rises 75 feet, with a temple at the summit. Interior walls are covered with hieroglyphic text, one of the longest Maya texts ever found, telling Palenque's history, listing rulers, recording births, deaths, battles, and astronomical events. In 1949, archaeologist Alberto Ruz-Luelier noticed a floor stone with holes. He excavated a stairway descending deep into the pyramid. 4 years later, he reached a crypt containing a massive stone sarcophagus. Inside lay Pakal's remains, an elderly man adorned with jade jewelry, a jade mask covering his face. The sarcophagus lid was extraordinary. 5 tons of carved stone showing Pakal falling into the underworld, depicted as falling into the earth monster's jaws. Above him rises the world tree connecting underworld, earth, and heavens. In the 1960s, Erich von Däniken claimed this showed Pakal piloting a spaceship. It was nonsense. The imagery is clearly Maya cosmology, death, rebirth, the journey between realms. But the ancient astronaut theory persists. The real Pakal was a master of propaganda. He claimed descent from gods. He commissioned art and architecture that still astounds. The palace complex with its unique tower contains some of the finest Maya sculpture. Life in Palenque during his reign was prosperous. They controlled fertile valleys, grew maize, beans, squash, traded cacao, chocolate, highly valued across Mesoamerica. The Maya were obsessed with time and astronomy. At Palenque, astronomers tracked Venus, Sun, Moon. They calculated eclipses with remarkable precision. Their calendar was more accurate than the Julian calendar used in Europe at the same time. Pakal died in 683 AD around age 80, extraordinary for the period. His son continued building projects, adding the Temple of the Cross, Temple of the Sun, and Temple of the Foliated Cross. But Palenque's glory was brief. By the 9th century, decline came, drought, overpopulation, warfare. By 900 AD, the city was largely abandoned. The jungle moved in quickly. Within generations, trees grew through plazas, vines strangled buildings, roots split stones. Palenque remained buried until Spanish explorers reported ruins in the 1700s. Serious excavation began in the 1900s and continues today. The site is partially cleared. Main temples and palace are visible, but walk into the forest behind and you find dozens of unexcavated mounds, each likely containing structures, tombs, carvings. You can climb the Temple of the Inscriptions, steep stairs to the summit where Pakal's hieroglyphic history covers walls. You can't enter the tomb anymore, but you stand directly above where the king sleeps in jade. You can walk through the palace, exploring rooms, courtyards, corridors. See the tower. Read inscriptions if you've studied Maya glyphs, or read the translations provided. You're reading words of people who lived 1,300 years ago. Their names, their victories, their losses. Palenque reminds us that ancient people documented their lives, that history is literature, not just archaeology, that we can hear voices across centuries if we learn their scripts. It reminds us that propaganda is ancient, that rulers always claim divine authority, that every civilization links leaders to gods. And it reminds us that even the most powerful rulers die, that magnificent cities fall, that Pakal, despite divine pretensions and architectural achievements, is dust. The jungle reclaimed Palenque once. Without maintenance it would again. Trees grow fast here. Nature is patient. As howler monkeys roar and parrots flash between temples, as mist rises from the jungle floor, we leave Palenque's carved histories behind and return to Greece, to a real catastrophe that inspired myths, to a city swallowed by earthquake and tsunami, to Helike. Chapter 4, Helike. On a winter night in 373 BC, the earth shook. The Greek city of Helike on the northern Peloponnese coast collapsed. A tsunami followed, swallowing what the earthquake had broken. By morning, the city had vanished beneath the Gulf of Corinth. Every building, every street, every person who hadn't fled. The poet Ovid wrote, "In the depths of the sea, one may still see the walls and drowned city ruins." For over 2,000 years, travelers claimed to see ruins beneath clear Mediterranean water. Bronze statues, building foundations, stone streets. But modern scholars were skeptical. If the city existed, where was it? For centuries, Helike was considered semi-mythical. Until 2001, when archaeologists Dora Katsanapoulou and Stephen Soter found it. Not underwater, buried under 20 feet of sediment, 4 miles inland from the modern coast. The tsunami had swallowed the city, but geological processes had raised the land and filled the lagoon. The city was perfectly preserved in mud, classical Greek buildings, pottery, coins, all frozen at the moment of disaster. Helike was important in its day. Founded in Mycenaean times, it led the Achaean League, a confederation of 12 cities. The city was sacred to Poseidon, god of earthquakes and sea. A temple housed a famous bronze statue that pilgrims came to see. The irony is cruel. The city devoted to the earthquake god was destroyed by an earthquake. Life in Helike in 373 BC was typical for a prosperous Greek city. About 10,000 people lived there. In the agora, farmers sold olives and grain. Potters displayed wares. Merchants traded. Philosophers debated in colonnades. Religious festivals honored Poseidon. Processions wound through streets. Bulls were sacrificed. Priests poured libations into the sea. Later writers claimed there were omens, animals fleeing, snakes and rats pouring from holes, the sea drawing back. These might be real observations. Animals sense seismic activity before humans do. On that winter night, the earthquake struck, violent, prolonged. The ground liquefied. Helike was built on sedimentary soil that turned to quicksand. Buildings collapsed. The temple fell. The bronze Poseidon toppled. People ran, but streets were falling apart. Then came the wave. A tsunami generated by the quake crashed over the coastal city, flooding it completely. Those who survived the earthquake drowned. Those who'd fled watched from hills as their city vanished beneath churning water. When morning came, a lagoon covered where Helike had been. The bronze Poseidon was visible beneath shallow water, standing upright in temple ruins. Tourists came for centuries to see it. Eventually, sediment buried everything. The lagoon filled. The land rose. The memory persisted in literature, but the physical location was lost. Modern archaeologists searched for decades. They dredged the seabed. They surveyed coastlines. Nothing. Then Katsanapoulou suggested looking inland. Using ground-penetrating radar, they found it. Classical walls, pottery, evidence of earthquake and sudden burial. The preservation is remarkable. Pottery intact, building foundations visible, street grid clear, evidence of earthquake, buildings tilted, walls sheared, pottery smashed. What they haven't found is the famous bronze Poseidon. It's either buried deeper or was salvaged in antiquity. Today, excavation continues. There's a museum nearby displaying artifacts and explaining the disaster. Helike became famous in antiquity as a cautionary tale. Plato mentioned it. Some scholars believe it inspired the Atlantis myth. Plato wrote about Atlantis only a decade after Helike's destruction. A coastal city swallowed by the sea in a single day. The parallels are striking. Whether or not it inspired Atlantis, Helike shows such disasters are real. Cities can vanish. Earthquakes and tsunamis rewrite geography overnight. The earth is unstable. Tectonic forces don't care about temples or devotion. The people of Helike worshipped Poseidon, built temples, sacrificed bulls. And he, or the geological forces we name after him, destroyed them anyway. Standing at the excavation site looking at foundations emerging from earth, you feel the weight of sudden disaster. One night people slept in their homes. They never woke, or woke to terror, walls collapsing, ground liquefying, water rushing in. Helike reminds us that disasters don't discriminate, that prosperity offers no protection, that the earth moves according to its own rhythms, indifferent to human life. But it also reminds us that what's buried can be found, that patient archaeology recovers what seems lost, that the dead can speak if we dig deep enough to listen. As we stand above the buried city, we prepare to close this journey through lost cities. From Atlantis to Helike, from sunken dreams to earthquake graves, we've walked ruins on 6 continents. We've seen civilizations rise and fall. We've touched stones carved by hands turned to dust. And now, as darkness deepens and sleep approaches, we leave the lost cities behind. But they stay with us, in memory, in dreams, in the reminder that everything we build is temporary. The stones remain, the stories persist, and somewhere always another city waits to be found. Chapter 5: Pompeii. A city that died in a single day, and lives forever because of it. On the morning of August 24th, in the year 79 AD, the people of Pompeii woke to another beautiful summer day. The sky was clear. The forum bustled with merchants setting up their stalls. The smell of fresh bread drifted from bakeries along the Via dell'Abbondanza. No one noticed the mountain. Mount Vesuvius loomed behind the city as it always had. Green slopes covered in vineyards, peaceful, familiar. It had been quiet for 800 years. The people of Pompeii didn't even know it was a volcano. In the House of the Faun, one of the grandest homes in the city, slaves swept mosaics depicting Alexander the Great in battle. In the public baths, men gathered to discuss politics and business, their voices echoing off marble walls. At the amphitheater, workers prepared for afternoon games. Children played in the streets. A dog lay chained in a courtyard, dozing in the sun. In a tavern, someone scratched graffiti into the wall. "I was here." Life, ordinary, precious life. Then at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Vesuvius exploded. The sound was like the sky tearing open. A column of ash and pumice shot 15 miles into the air, spreading like a vast umbrella that blotted out the sun. Within minutes, day turned to night. Hot stones began to rain down on the city, pumice the size of fists, then larger, crashing through roof tiles, piling up in the streets. People ran for shelter, covering their heads, choking on sulfur-thick air. For hours the ash fell. Roofs collapsed under the weight. Buildings groaned and buckled. Those who could flee ran toward the harbor, toward the roads leading to Naples. But thousands stayed behind, huddled in their homes, waiting for it to end. They didn't know that worse was coming. Just after midnight, the eruption column collapsed. A pyroclastic surge, an avalanche of superheated gas and rock, roared down the mountainside at over 100 miles per hour. It reached Pompeii in minutes. The heat was instant, 500 degrees. People died where they stood, their bodies buried in ash that hardened around them like concrete, preserving their final moments for 2,000 years. A mother clutching her child, 2 girls holding hands, a man covering his face, a family huddled together in a cellar. When the ash finally settled, Pompeii was gone, buried under 20 feet of volcanic debris, erased from the landscape as if it had never existed. For 17 centuries, it remained hidden, the location forgotten. Farmers planted crops over the ruins, never knowing an entire city lay beneath their feet. Until 1748, when workers digging a canal struck something hard. Stone walls, frescoes still bright with color, streets perfectly preserved. They had found Pompeii. The excavations revealed a city frozen in time, bread still in the ovens, wine jugs still on tables, political slogans painted on walls, love letters scratched into doorways. And the people, preserved as voids in the hardened ash. Archaeologists poured plaster into these spaces, revealing the citizens of Pompeii exactly as they were in their final moments. Today, you can walk the streets of Pompeii and see a Roman city as it actually was. Not ruins worn by time, but a snapshot, a moment sealed in ash. The bakery where Modestus made his bread, the brothel with its painted advertisements, the forum where politicians gave speeches, the homes where families laughed and argued and lived. Pompeii wasn't destroyed by time, it was stopped by it. Perhaps that's why it haunts us, because we see ourselves in those plaster casts. We know that on that August morning, no one in Pompeii believed their world would end that day. They had plans, dreams. Tomorrow was guaranteed. Until it wasn't. The ash took everything, but in taking it also gave. It gave us a window into lives lived 2,000 years ago. It gave us their stories, their humanity. And now, as the ash settles in our minds, we leave the Roman streets behind and climb higher, into mountains wrapped in cloud, toward a city the Spanish never found, toward Machu Picchu. Chapter 6, Machu Picchu. The city the conquistadors never conquered, the sanctuary they never found. High in the Peruvian Andes, 8,000 feet above sea level, the Inca built something impossible. A city carved into a mountain ridge so remote, so perfectly hidden, that it remained unknown to the outside world for 400 years. No wheels, no iron tools, no written language, yet they moved stones weighing 50 tons up impossible slopes and fitted them together so precisely that not even a knife blade can slip between them. How? The Inca didn't answer that question. They left no written records, no explanations carved in stone, only the city itself clinging to the clouds. Construction likely began around 1450 AD under the rule of Emperor Pachacuti, the greatest builder of the Inca Empire. He didn't just want a city, he wanted a royal estate, a sacred retreat, a place where earth touched sky. For nearly a century, Machu Picchu thrived. Terraces cascaded down the mountainside, growing corn and potatoes in soil carried up by hand. Fountains flowed with spring water channeled through stone aqueducts, temples aligned with the movements of the sun. In the Temple of the Sun, priests tracked solstices through perfectly positioned windows. At the Teotihuacan stone, the hitching post of the sun, they performed rituals to tie the sun to the earth, ensuring it would return after winter's darkness. Life here followed the rhythms of sky and season. Farmers tended the terraces at dawn, their hands working soil their grandparents had carried stone by stone. Weavers created textiles with patterns that told stories without words. Children played on stone plazas while alpacas grazed nearby, their bells chiming softly in mountain wind. In the evening, smoke from cooking fires rose into mist. Families gathered in stone houses with thatched roofs. They spoke in Quechua, the language of the Inca, sharing meals of quinoa and roasted kai, their voices soft against the vast silence of peaks. But then came 1532. Spanish conquistadors arrived in Peru. They brought horses, steel, disease, and hunger for gold. The Inca Empire, the largest in the Americas, began to collapse. Within a year, Emperor Atahualpa was executed. Within decades, the empire was shattered. Yet Machu Picchu remained untouched. The Spanish never found it. They heard rumors of lost cities in the mountains, but the trails were treacherous, and the Inca who knew the way kept their silence. Some died protecting that secret. And so Machu Picchu was abandoned, not destroyed, not conquered, simply left. The people walked down the mountain paths one last time. They left their tools in place, their pottery on shelves, their terraces still green with crops. Why? No one knows for certain. Perhaps they fled the Spanish advance. Perhaps disease reached them. Perhaps they were called to fight in desperate final battles elsewhere. Or perhaps, knowing the Spanish would never value what they'd built, they simply walked away. Let the jungle take it. Let the clouds hide it. For 4 centuries, only local farmers knew it existed. They called it Old Peak and planted crops on the ancient terraces, never speaking of it to outsiders. Until July 24, 1911. An American historian named Hiram Bingham, guided by a local boy named Pablito Alvarez, climbed through dense jungle and emerged onto stone plazas covered in moss and vines. He saw walls perfectly fitted, temples intact, terraces climbing toward clouds. Machu Picchu had been hidden, not lost, waiting. Today, it stands as it did 500 years ago. Stone walls rising from mountain mist, terraces stepping down impossible slopes, the Temple of the Sun still tracking solstices. But walk those plazas in early morning before the tourists arrive and you can almost hear them. The weavers singing work songs, the children laughing, the priests chanting prayers to Inti, the sun god. They left no written words, but they left this. A city that says, we were here, we built with stone and sky, we honored the earth and worshipped the sun, we created beauty in impossible places. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps some cities aren't meant to be understood, only witnessed, only felt. As mist rolls through the ruins and clouds wrap the peaks, we descend from these heights and journey across an ocean, toward stone carved from desert cliffs, toward a city that glows pink in dying light, toward Petra. Chapter 7. Petra, Rose City of Shadows. The city carved from stone, the rose-red capital of a people the Romans couldn't break. To reach Petra, you must first walk through darkness, through the sick, a narrow gorge that splits the mountains like a wound. Its walls rise 300 feet on either side, so close in places you can touch both at once. The path twists for over a mile, cool and shadowed, the sky reduced to a ribbon of blue far above. And then, through a final gap in stone, you see it. The treasury, Al-Khazne, a temple facade carved directly into the rose-pink cliff face, towering 130 feet high. Columns and capitals, urns and friezes, all sculpted from living rock. Not built, carved, revealed. This was Petra, the capital of the Nabatean people, who controlled the crossroads of the ancient world for nearly 5 centuries. They were traders, these Nabateans, masters of the desert. They built an empire not through conquest but through water and commerce. In one of the driest places on earth, they engineered aqueducts and cisterns that could store millions of gallons. They turned stone into a fortress that could survive sieges simply by outlasting thirst. Petra sat at the junction of trade routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean. Caravans arrived daily, their camels loaded with frankincense from Yemen, silk from China, spices from India. The Nabateans took their cut, grew wealthy, grew powerful. And they carved their wealth into stone. The treasury was only the beginning. Beyond it lay an entire city hidden in the cliffs. The street of facades, where hundreds of tombs were cut into the rock face, each one a mansion for the dead. The Roman theater, seating 4,000, carved from a single hillside. The royal tombs, massive facades decorated with columns and pediments that glowed like fire in the setting sun. And rising above it all, the monastery, Ad-Dar, larger even than the treasury, reached only by climbing 800 rock-cut steps. A temple or tomb, no one is certain, facing the vast emptiness of the desert. Life in Petra moved to rhythms of trade and water. In the markets near the colonnaded street, merchants sold perfumes and textiles, metals and precious stones. Languages mixed, Nabatean, Greek, Latin, Arabic, as traders from a dozen nations bargained and argued and made deals that would echo across empires. Children played in the cool shadows of the sick. Women drew water from cisterns carved into the rock. Priests performed rituals in high places, burning incense to Dashara, the chief Nabatean god, whose sacred stone stood at the city's heart. In workshops carved into cliff walls, stonemasons worked with copper chisels and wooden mallets, shaping rock grain by grain. They carved tombs for wealthy families, each one unique. Some simple, others elaborate as palaces, with columns and chambers that went deep into the mountain. They worked slowly. A single tomb might take years, but time meant nothing. The stone would last forever. For centuries, Petra prospered. The Nabateans remained independent even as empires rose and fell around them. They paid tribute to Rome but kept their autonomy, their culture, their desert kingdom. Until 106 AD. The Roman Emperor Trajan annexed Nabatea. The trade routes shifted. New roads bypassed Petra. Gradually, the caravans came less frequently. The markets grew quieter. Then in 363 AD, an earthquake struck. Buildings collapsed. Aqueducts shattered. The city that had survived by mastering water could no longer deliver it. People began to leave. Not all at once. Slowly, over decades. Families packed what they could carry and joined caravans heading to other cities, other opportunities. The stonemasons left their chisels. The merchants left their stalls. Petra became a place of echoes. Bedouin tribes moved into the caves and tombs, using them as homes and animal pens. They knew the city's secrets, its hidden cisterns and sheltered chambers. For over 1,000 years they lived among the ruins, never speaking of them to outsiders. To the wider world, Petra became legend. Biblical scholars believed it was the place where Moses struck water from stone. Medieval crusaders passed nearby but never found the entrance. Tales spread of a lost city in the desert, filled with treasure. Until 1812. A Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, disguised as an Arab pilgrim, convinced a local guide to lead him through the sick. He emerged into the ancient city and realized he'd found what scholars had sought for centuries. Petra was revealed to the modern world. Today, the rose-red city stands open to the sky. The treasury's facade catches morning light and glows like burnished copper. Tourists walk where caravans once passed, cameras clicking where coins once changed hands. But go at dusk, after the crowds have left. Sit in the shadow of the monastery and watch the stone change colors as the sun sets, pink to orange to deep red to purple. And listen. In the silence, you can almost hear them. The merchants are calling their wares. The stonemasons' chisels are ringing. The camels' bells chiming as caravans arrive through the sick. Petra was never conquered, it was simply bypassed, left behind by changing times. But the stone remains, and the stone remembers. As desert wind carries sand through empty streets and shadows lengthen in carved facades, we leave these cliffs behind and sail across an ocean, toward an island where stone faces watch the horizon, toward Easter Island. Chapter 8: Easter Island. The most isolated inhabited place on Earth. A tiny speck of volcanic rock in the vast Pacific, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. And on this island, scattered across the landscape, stand the Moai. Nearly 900 stone giants, their backs to the sea, their blank eyes watching the island's interior. Silent, unmoving, waiting. Who carved them? Why? And how did a small island population create one of history's greatest mysteries? The story begins around 1200 AD, when Polynesian voyagers arrived in double-hulled canoes, guided by stars and swells across impossible distances. They found an island covered in palm forests, its soil rich, its waters full of fish. They called it Te Pito o Te Henua, the navel of the world. The Rapa Nui people thrived. The population grew. Clans formed, each tracing ancestry to the original settlers. And to honor their ancestors, to channel their mana, their spiritual power, they began to carve. At Rano Raraku, a volcanic crater, they found the perfect stone. Volcanic tough, soft enough to carve but hard enough to endure. Using basalt hand axes, teams of carvers worked directly on the quarry walls, cutting the moai from living rock. The average moai stood 13 feet tall and weighed 14 tons, but some were larger, much larger. One unfinished statue, still attached to the quarry wall, stands 70 feet tall. If completed, it would have weighed over 200 tons. They carved hundreds, faces with strong brows, long noses, thin lips, no two exactly alike. Each one represented a specific ancestor, a chief, a person whose mana needed to be preserved. But carving was only the beginning. The truly impossible part was moving them. Somehow, using only ropes, wooden sledges, and human muscle, they transported these multi-ton statues across miles of rough terrain. They raised them onto massive stone platforms called ahu, facing inland to watch over villages and agricultural lands. Then they carved eyes from white coral and red scoria. When the eyes were placed, the moai came alive. The ancestor's spirit inhabited the stone. For generations, the clans competed. Each tried to carve larger moai, build grander ahu. It became a measure of prestige, of spiritual power, of devotion to the ancestors. But there was a cost. Moving the moai required wood, lots of it, logs for sledges, rollers, levers. Trees were cut faster than they could grow. The palm forests that had covered the island began to disappear. Without trees, soil eroded, crops failed. Canoes couldn't be built, so offshore fishing became impossible. The diet shifted to rats and chickens, then even those became scarce. Resources dwindled, tensions rose. The clans that had competed in carving began to compete for survival. And then came the conflicts. The Rapa Nui turned on each other. Villages were raided, food stores burned, and in acts of desecration that must have been unthinkable before, the moai were toppled. Warriors pushed the stone giants off their platforms, face down in the dirt. They broke the coral eyes. They desecrated the ancestors. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, on Easter Sunday, giving the island its western name, the society was in collapse. The moai lay scattered, most toppled and broken. The people lived in caves, the forests gone, the soil depleted. The Europeans brought worse: smallpox, slavery. In 1862, Peruvian slavers kidnapped 1,500 Rapa Nui people, including the king and the priests who could read Rongorongo, the island's undeciphered script. By 1877, only 111 people remained alive on Easter Island. The knowledge of how to carve the moai, how to move them, why certain ones were placed where they were, all of it died with the priests and chiefs taken as slaves. Today, many of the moai have been re-erected, standing once again on their platforms. They face inland as they once did, watching over an island much changed. But at Rano Raraku, the quarry, nearly 400 moai remain half-carved, still attached to the rock, abandoned mid-creation when the collapse came. Some are complete except for the final cuts. Others have barely begun. They wait there, emerging from the hillside like ghosts, frozen in the moment when everything stopped. Walk among them at dawn, when mist clings to the crater slopes, and you can feel the weight of unfinished dreams. Each moai represents countless hours of labor, generations of tradition, the hope that honoring the ancestors would ensure the future. But the future came differently than planned. Easter Island stands as a warning, but also as a testament. A warning about what happens when resources are consumed faster than they can renew, when competition becomes more important than cooperation, when we forget that the Earth's gifts are not infinite. But also a testament to human creativity, devotion, and persistence. Despite isolation, despite limited resources, the Rapa Nui created art that endures. They carved their beliefs into stone so solid that even catastrophe couldn't erase them entirely. The moai still stand, silent witnesses to both achievement and collapse. And as the Pacific wind whistles through empty eye sockets and waves crash against volcanic shores, we leave this remote island behind and journey back across time, toward walls that witnessed the greatest siege in legend, toward Troy. Chapter 9. Troy WLLS of Legend and War. For 3,000 years it was dismissed as myth, a story told by Homer in the Iliad, a war fought over a beautiful woman, lasting 10 years, ending with a wooden horse and flames. Scholars believed it was fiction, beautiful fiction but fiction nonetheless, until a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann refused to believe that. In 1870, armed with a copy of Homer's Iliad and an obsession, he began digging at a mound in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik. His wife thought he was mad. Academics mocked him. Then he found the walls. Massive fortifications, layers upon layers of settlements, gold treasures, evidence of fire and violence. He had found Troy. Not just one Troy, but 9 cities, built one atop another over 3,000 years, each generation building on the ruins of the last, rising higher, growing stronger. Troy Vi and Troy Villa, cities from the late Bronze Age around 1200 BC, match Homer's descriptions. Powerful walls, strategic location controlling trade routes between Europe and Asia, evidence of siege and destruction. The Trojan War might have been real. Imagine it now, the city in its glory around 1250 BC. Troy stands on a hill overlooking the Dardanelles, the narrow strait where the Aegean Sea meets the Sea of Marmara. Every ship passing between east and west must sail beneath these walls, and Troy controls the passage, growing wealthy on trade and tribute. The walls rise 30 feet high, built from massive limestone blocks fitted so precisely they need no mortar. Towers punctuate the fortifications, giving archers clear lines of sight across the plain that stretches to the sea. Inside the walls, stone-paved streets wind between houses with plastered walls painted in bright colors. The palace of King Priam sits at the highest point, its columns visible from ships far out at sea. In the lower city, outside the citadel walls but still protected by outer fortifications, craftsmen work bronze and gold. Potters shape clay from the nearby river. Merchants negotiate with traders from across the known world, Mycenaean Greeks, Hittites from Anatolia, Cypriots, Egyptians. Women draw water from deep wells. Children play in the shadow of the great walls, not knowing those walls will soon be tested. And then the ships arrive. According to legend, 1,000 Greek ships, the face that launched 1,000 ships, sailed to Troy because Prince Paris stole Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Perhaps it was about Helen, perhaps it was about trade routes and power, perhaps both. For 10 years the Greeks besieged the city. They couldn't breach the walls. Troy's fortifications were too strong, its position too advantageous. So the Trojans stayed inside, enduring, waiting for the Greeks to tire to give up to sail home. Battles raged on the plain between the city and the sea. Achilles killed Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, and dragged his body around the walls. King Priam begged for his son's body back. The war ground on, years passing, men dying, the walls holding. Then came the horse. The Greeks built a massive wooden horse and left it on the beach, their ships seemingly sailing away in defeat. The Trojans, jubilant, dragged the horse inside the city as a trophy. That night, Greek soldiers hidden inside the horse emerged. They opened the gates. The Greek army, which had only pretended to leave, poured in. Troy burned. The archaeological evidence supports a violent end. Troy Villa shows clear signs of destruction by fire around 1180 BC. Arrowheads found in the streets, skeletons buried in the rubble, evidence of desperate final battles. Whether it happened exactly as Homer told it, we'll never know, but something happened. A great city fell. A civilization ended. The survivors scattered. Some fled to Italy, where legend says they founded Rome. Others disappeared into history, their stories lost. Troy was abandoned. Over centuries, wind and rain eroded the ruins. Soil covered the stones. The mound grew, layer by layer, as new settlements rose and fell. The memory persisted only in stories, in Homer's epic, in Roman legends, in the tales travelers told, until Schliemann's obsession brought it back to light. Today, you can walk the ruins of Troy. You can stand where the walls once rose. You can look out across the plain toward the Aegean and imagine the Greek ships beached on the shore, the warriors arming themselves at dawn, the smoke rising from cook fires in both camps. The walls remain, though not at their full height, enough to show the scale, the ambition, the strength that held off an army for 10 years. And in the tourist area nearby stands a reconstruction of the famous horse. It's silly, perhaps, a modern prop, but children climb inside it, laughing, and maybe that's appropriate. Because Troy reminds us that even the mightiest walls eventually fall, that every civilization, no matter how powerful, is vulnerable, that pride and stubbornness can doom even the strongest city. But it also reminds us that stories have power, that memory persists even when stones crumble, that legends might carry truth if we're willing to dig deep enough to find it. As the sun sets over the Dardanelles and shadows lengthen across the plain where heroes once fought, we leave these legendary walls behind and journey into deeper time, to a place that predates Troy by 7,000 years, to the world's first temple, to Göbekli Tepe. Chapter 10. Göbekli Tepe, World's First Temple. The place that rewrote human history. In southeastern Turkey, on a barren hilltop, stand stone circles that should not exist. Massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 16 tons, are arranged in rings, carved with animals, foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, erected with precision and purpose. The shocking part, they're 11,500 years old. This makes Göbekli Tepe older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids by 7,000 years, older than pottery, metalworking, or the wheel. It was built by people we thought were simple hunter-gatherers, people who supposedly lived in small bands, following herds, gathering plants, surviving day to day. But you don't build temples when you're just surviving. Göbekli Tepe changed everything we thought we knew about civilization. Before its discovery, archaeologists believed the sequence was clear. First came agriculture, then settled communities, then surplus food, then specialized labor, then religion, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe reverses that. The temple came first. People who still hunted and gathered, who didn't farm or domesticate animals, who had no permanent villages, they built this. They quarried massive stones from bedrock, carved them with flint tools, transported them up a hill, and erected them in perfect circles. Why? The site was discovered in 1963, but its importance wasn't recognized until 1994, when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations. What he found astonished him. 20 stone circles uncovered so far, but ground-penetrating radar suggests at least 20 more lie buried. Each circle contains T-shaped pillars arranged around two larger central pillars. The pillars represent stylized humans, arms carved on the sides, hands at the front, though no faces. The smaller pillars face the larger ones, as if gathering, as if witnessing. Carvings cover many stones, animals rendered with remarkable skill, snakes winding around pillars, foxes leaping, birds in flight. Some images are beautiful, others are disturbing. Headless human bodies, disembodied hands. What rituals happened here? The placement suggests ceremonies, gatherings, perhaps feasts. Archaeologists found thousands of animal bones, evidence of massive butchering events. Wild gazelle, aurochs, wild boar. People came from miles around. They brought food. They carved stone. They participated in something that required organization, planning, belief in something larger than survival. And then around 8000 BC, they buried it. Deliberately, carefully, they filled the circles with tons of debris, covering the pillars completely, not destruction, preservation, as if the temple's purpose was fulfilled. No one knows why. Walking among the excavated circles today, you feel the weight of questions. These stones were carved by hands like yours, by minds like yours, but by people whose world we can barely imagine. No cities, no farms, no written language, yet they created art, architecture, and what can only be called religion. They looked at stars and carved what they saw. They feared predators and honored them in stone. They gathered by the hundreds, perhaps thousands, to build something that would outlast them all. Some archaeologists believe Göbekli Tepe wasn't just a temple but the birthplace of civilization itself. That the need to gather here, to maintain the site, to feed the workers, that this need drove the invention of agriculture. Perhaps we didn't settle down to build temples. Perhaps we built temples, and that forced us to settle down. Perhaps religion came first, everything else followed. Stand at Göbekli Tepe at dawn, as light touches the carved pillars and throws the animal reliefs into sharp shadow. The wind blows across the hilltop as it has for 12,000 years. And imagine them, the people who came here in animal skins, carrying flint tools, their faces painted for ceremony, who carved these stones with nothing but harder stones and endless patience, who believed in something strongly enough to move mountains. They had no metal, no beasts of burden, no wheels. But they had vision, they had cooperation, they had faith that what they built mattered. And they were right. Göbekli Tepe still stands, still speaks across millennia, still asks us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about who we were and what we're capable of. As the sun climbs higher and heat begins to shimmer off bare stone, we leave this ancient hilltop and journey into jungle shadow, toward temples swallowed by trees, toward the silent throne of the Khmer kings, toward Angkor Wat. Chapter 11. Angkor Wat, Jungle's Silent Throne. The largest religious monument ever built. A temple city carved from sandstone and devotion, rising from the Cambodian jungle like a stone prayer to the heavens. For nearly 500 years, Angkor was the heart of the Khmer Empire, a civilization that ruled much of Southeast Asia, whose kings commanded armies and controlled trade routes stretching from China to India. And at its center stood Angkor Wat, a temple so vast, so perfect in its proportions, that it appears on Cambodia's national flag, a structure so aligned with cosmic principles that it represents Mount Meru, the mythical home of Hindu gods. But for centuries it was lost. Not lost in the sense of forgotten, local people always knew it was there, but lost to the wider world, hidden beneath jungles so thick that explorers passed within miles and never saw it. Until 1860, when French naturalist Henry Mauhat pushed through the vegetation and emerged into a temple complex that left him speechless. But Angkor's story begins much earlier. In the early 9th century, King Jayavarman II unified the Khmer kingdoms and established his capital in the Angkor region. Over the next 4 centuries, successive kings built temple after temple, each trying to outdo their predecessors. They built the Bagan with its massive stone faces smiling from every tower. They built Ta Prohm, where trees now grow through the ruins, their roots splitting stones like slow earthquakes. They built Pre Khan, Banti Esre, Neek Peen. But Angkor Wat, built by King Suryavarman II in the early 12th century, surpassed them all. It took 30 years to build. Thousands of workers quarried sandstone blocks from mountains 30 miles away and floated them down rivers on rafts. Architects designed every measurement according to sacred geometry. Sculptors carved over 3,000 apsaras, celestial dancers, into the walls, no two exactly alike. The temple complex covers 400 acres. The central tower rises 200 feet above the jungle floor. The outer wall, surrounded by a moat 600 feet wide, encloses an area larger than Vatican City. And covering the walls, miles and miles of bas-relief carvings depicting Hindu epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the churning of the ocean of milk, where gods and demons work together to create the elixir of immortality. Life in Angkor during its golden age was extraordinary. The city supported over 1 million people, larger than any European city of the time. Sophisticated water management systems fed rice paddies and filled vast reservoirs called barays. Markets bustled with goods from across Asia. In the royal palace, now mostly vanished because it was built of wood, the king lived as a god-king, the Divaraja, intermediary between heaven and earth. Brahmins performed elaborate rituals. Dancers trained from childhood to embody celestial grace. Common people lived in wooden houses on stilts, farming rice in paddies fed by the massive hydraulic network. Children played in the canals. Fishermen cast nets in the Tonal Sap Lake, which seasonally doubled in size, teeming with fish. Everyone from king to farmer participated in festivals at the temples. They brought offerings of flowers and incense. They watched sacred dances performed on temple terraces. They felt part of something vast and eternal. But nothing is eternal. In the 13th century, the empire began to weaken. War with neighboring Siam drained resources. The massive water system, which had sustained the city for centuries, began to fail. Deforestation caused erosion and siltation. Climate change brought severe droughts followed by devastating floods. And then came a shift in belief. Theravada Buddhism spread through the region, replacing Hinduism. The new religion had no use for god-kings or massive temple construction. In 1431, Siamese armies sacked Angkor. The capital moved south to Phnom Penh, closer to trade routes. The temples weren't destroyed, but they were abandoned. The jungle moved in. Strangler figs sent roots through cracks in the stone. Their roots grew thick as pythons, slowly prying apart walls that had stood for centuries. Moss covered the bas-reliefs. Vines draped the towers. Bats nested in the dark corridors. Buddhist monks maintained Angkor Wat itself, preventing complete abandonment. But the surrounding temples fell to the forest. Ta Prohm became a symbiosis of stone and tree, so entangled that removing the trees would collapse the temple. For 400 years, Angkor slept beneath green shadows. Today, Angkor Wat has been restored. The moat is clear again. The stones are cleaned. Tourists by the millions walk the galleries, photographing the bas-reliefs, climbing the steep stairs to the central sanctuary. But go at dawn, before the crowds arrive. Watch the sun rise behind the 5 towers, their reflections perfect in the moat's still water. Walk through the galleries as light angles through the windows, illuminating carvings that have watched centuries pass. In those quiet moments you can almost hear them. The chanting of priests, the rhythm of dancers' bells, the murmur of crowds gathered for festivals, the hammers of stonemasons always building, always perfecting. Angkor Wat reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations return to jungle. That stone, for all its seeming permanence, is vulnerable. That nature always reclaims what we build. But it also reminds us that beauty persists. That faith can move mountains, or at least millions of tons of sandstone. That what we create with devotion endures, even when empires fall. As jungle sounds fade and we leave the stone towers behind, we cross the Pacific once more, toward a civilization that built pyramids without ever seeing those of Egypt, toward an avenue where the dead were meant to walk among stars, toward Teotihuacan. Chapter 12. Teotihuacan, Pyramid Avenue of the Dead. The City of the Gods. That's what the Aztecs called it when they found it, centuries after it was abandoned. They believed no humans could have built something so immense, only gods. They were wrong about the gods, but right about the immensity. At its height, around 450 AD, Teotihuacan was the sixth largest city in the world. 125,000 people lived within its carefully planned grid. Its pyramids rivaled those of Egypt. Its influence reached across Mesoamerica, from modern-day Mexico to Guatemala. And then, around 550 AD, the city burned. The people scattered, and for 1,000 years no one remembered who built it or why. Even its original name is lost. Teotihuacan is what the Aztecs called it 6 centuries after its fall. The city rises from the Valley of Mexico, about 30 miles northeast of modern Mexico City. Its centerpiece is the Avenue of the Dead, a wide, straight road running for more than a mile through the heart of the city. The avenue isn't really a road, it's too wide, too ceremonial. And the dead part, the Aztecs saw the platforms lining it and thought they were tombs. They weren't, but the name stuck. At the northern end stands the Pyramid of the Moon, framed perfectly by the mountain behind it. At the southern end, the Ciudadela, a massive sunken plaza that could hold 100,000 people. And dominating the eastern side of the avenue is the Pyramid of the Sun, the third largest pyramid in the world. The Pyramid of the Sun is staggering. Its base covers the same area as the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises over 200 feet, built from an estimated 1 million cubic meters of stone and earth. No mortar holds it together, just layer upon layer of adobe bricks and rubble, faced with stone, painted bright red and covered with sacred imagery now long eroded. Climbing its steep stairs, you feel the pull in your legs, the thinning of breath. Reaching the top, you see the entire city spread before you, the Avenue of the Dead stretching south, smaller pyramids and platforms marking sacred spaces, the remains of residential compounds where people lived in multi-family apartments made of stone and plaster. Who built this? We don't know. The people left no written records we can read. No king lists. No dedicatory inscriptions explaining who ordered what built or why. But we know they were master planners. The entire city was laid out on a grid aligned 15 degrees east of true north. Every building, every street, every residential complex conformed to this plan. Why that specific angle? Some archaeologists believe it aligns with the setting of the Pleiades constellation. Others think it tracks the sun's position on specific ceremonial days. The answer is lost. What we do know is that Teotihuacan was a cosmopolitan city. Neighborhoods held people from across Mesoamerica, Zapotecs from Oaxaca, Maya from the south, merchants from the Gulf Coast. Each group maintained its own cultural identity while contributing to the city's wealth and power. In the merchants' barrio, traders dealt in obsidian from nearby mines. Teotihuacan controlled the obsidian trade, and obsidian blades were as valuable as steel would later be. They exported tools and weapons across thousands of miles. In residential compounds, families lived in complexes with central courtyards. Walls were covered in murals, bright reds, greens, blues, depicting gods, animals, and scenes of paradise. Jaguars prowled through painted gardens. Birds with impossible colors sang in painted trees. Children played in the courtyards while their parents worked in craft workshops attached to the compounds. Life was communal. Families shared ovens, ate together, raised children collectively. In the great plaza of the Ciudadela, thousands gathered for ceremonies. Priests climbed the pyramids to perform rituals we can only guess at. Drums echoed off stone. Incense smoke rose toward the sun. At the Temple of the Feathered Serpent within the Ciudadela, archaeologists found something darker. Over 200 bodies buried in the temple's foundations. Sacrificial victims, their hands bound behind their backs, their remains showing they were warriors from different regions. Teotihuacan's power wasn't just economic and cultural. It was military and religious, enforced through ritual and fear. But that power didn't last. Around 550 AD, fire swept through the city. Not accidental fire, deliberate destruction. The temples along the Avenue of the Dead were systematically burned. Elite residences were targeted specifically. Evidence suggests the burning came from within, not from invaders. Revolution, perhaps, or collapse of the religious authority, or environmental crisis that turned the people against their rulers. Whatever the reason, Teotihuacan was abandoned, not slowly but rapidly. Within a generation, the great city was empty. The pyramids remained, too massive to destroy, but the people scattered to smaller settlements throughout the valley, never to return. For centuries, the ruins stood empty. Coyotes denned in the residential compounds. Birds nested in the pyramid's cracks. Rain and wind eroded the murals. When the Aztecs rose to power centuries later, they found Teotihuacan and were awed by it. They believed gods had built it. They incorporated it into their own mythology, claiming it was where the current age of the world began, where the gods sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion. The Aztecs never lived there, but they made pilgrimages to it, performing their own ceremonies among the ancient stones. Today, Teotihuacan is one of Mexico's most visited archaeological sites. You can climb the pyramids, walk the Avenue of the Dead, stand in the Ciudadela and imagine the plaza filled with thousands of people. But it's the silence that strikes you. Such a massive city, such ambitious architecture, such reach across the ancient world, yet we don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their kings' names. We don't know their language, their stories, their songs. They left stone but not words. Teotihuacan reminds us that civilizations can vanish almost completely, that even great cities can be forgotten, that power and glory are temporary. But it also reminds us that what we build can outlast what we write. That stone speaks even when languages die. That memory persists in monuments, even when names are lost. As the sun sets behind the Pyramid of the Sun and long shadows stretch across the Avenue of the Dead, we leave this city of mystery and travel east, across an ocean and centuries, toward gardens that may never have existed but are remembered nonetheless, toward Babylon. Chapter 13. Babylon Hanging Gardens Mirage. The name alone conjures images of impossible luxury, gleaming towers, hanging gardens cascading with flowers and fountains, kings who claimed divinity, priests who read the future in the stars. For nearly 2,000 years, Babylon was synonymous with power, wisdom, and decadence. It was the New York, the Rome, the Paris of the ancient world, a place where cultures collided, where wealth concentrated, where the ambitious came to make their fortunes. But walk through the ruins today in modern Iraq, and you might feel disappointed. Crumbling mud brick walls, reconstructions that look more like theme park attractions than ancient wonders, sand and scrub stretching to the horizon. Where is the glory? The glory is buried, or destroyed, or carried off to museums in Berlin and London, or existing only in stories that may be more legend than truth. Babylon's history spans millennia. Founded perhaps as early as 2300 BC, it became a major power under Hammurabi around 1750 BC, the king who codified laws on stone and declared that justice flowed from him like water. But Babylon's greatest era came much later, under King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BC. This was the Babylon of legend. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the city on a scale meant to overwhelm. The Ishtar Gate, dedicated to the goddess of love and war, rose over 40 feet, covered in glazed blue bricks with reliefs of bulls and dragons in yellow and white. Walking through, it must have felt like entering heaven. The processional way led from the gate to the center of the city, its walls lined with 120 lions, each over 6 feet long, striding eternally forward. During festivals, priests paraded through these streets, carrying statues of gods while crowds pressed against the walls to watch. At the city's heart stood the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, and beside it rose the Etemenenki, the ziggurat, the Tower of Babel from the Bible, a stepped pyramid that reached nearly 300 feet into the sky, its peak crowned with a shrine where, according to Herodotus, the god himself would descend to sleep with a chosen priestess. Was that true? Probably not, but the tower was real, massive, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Nebuchadnezzar's palace was equally grand, its walls covered in glazed brick depicting lions and palms, its throne room designed to intimidate foreign ambassadors with its scale and luxury. And supposedly, in or near this palace, were the Hanging Gardens, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Ancient writers described them in breathless terms. Gardens built on terraces, rising level upon level, planted with trees and flowers from across the empire, watered by a system of pumps that drew water from the Euphrates River to the highest terraces, where it cascaded down through the gardens like rain. They said Nebuchadnezzar built them for his wife, Amytis, who missed the green mountains of her homeland, Media. In the flat, dusty plains of Mesopotamia, he gave her mountains made of gardens. It's a beautiful story. The problem: no archaeological evidence of the gardens has ever been found, not in Babylon. Ancient Babylonian texts, which meticulously document Nebuchadnezzar's building projects, never mention them. So did they exist? Maybe they existed, but not in Babylon. Some scholars now think the gardens were actually in Nineveh, capital of Assyria, built by a different king a century earlier. Maybe Greek historians conflated the two cities. Or maybe they existed only in imagination, a legend that grew from exaggerated travelers' tales, a myth that persisted because it captured something essential, the idea that power could bend nature itself, that wealth could create paradise even in desert. Real or not, the Hanging Gardens represent what Babylon was, a place where anything seemed possible. Life in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a study in contrasts. Extreme wealth and grinding poverty existed side by side. Slaves taken from conquered nations, including Jews exiled from Jerusalem, labored on building projects alongside free workers. In the markets near the Euphrates, merchants sold grain from Egypt, lapis from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, purple dye from Phoenicia. Languages mixed: Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek. Scribes kept records on clay tablets, documenting everything from royal decrees to private loans. Priests climbed the ziggurat stairs to observe stars and planets. Babylonian astronomers were the ancient world's best. They could predict lunar eclipses, tracked planets, divided the sky into the zodiac signs we still use. But beneath the glory was violence. Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and destroyed Solomon's temple. He deported entire populations. His empire was built on conquest and maintained through fear. And empires built on conquest rarely last. In 539 BC, less than 30 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon without a battle. The priests, who controlled the city, opened the gates. They'd grown tired of Babylon's rulers. Cyrus allowed the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem. He allowed other conquered peoples to reclaim their lands. Babylon became just another provincial capital in the vast Persian Empire. Over centuries, the city declined. Alexander the Great planned to rebuild it as his capital but died before he could. His successors built new cities and abandoned Babylon. The Euphrates changed course, leaving the city without its water source. By the time of Christ, Babylon was ruins inhabited by scattered villages. The Ishtar Gate crumbled. The ziggurat collapsed. The palaces fell to dust. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists excavated what remained. They found the Ishtar Gate buried in sand. They reconstructed it in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, where it stands today, beautiful but out of place, like a wild animal in a zoo. Saddam Hussein, with characteristic hubris, built a palace atop the ancient ruins and attempted to reconstruct Babylon in the 1980s. His reconstructions are crude, archaeologically worthless, and now deteriorating. Modern Babylon is a confusion of ancient bricks and modern concrete, a palimpsest of empires, a place where you have to work to see past what's ruined to what was once glorious. But perhaps that's fitting. Babylon was always about illusion and reality intertwined, real gardens or mythical ones, real power or its performance, real wisdom or its appearance. The Hanging Gardens may never have existed, but they're remembered. Babylon itself is mostly gone, but its name still carries weight. Perhaps that's the real wonder, not what remains but what endures in memory, not the stones but the stories. As the sun sets over the Iraqi desert and the wind carries dust across broken walls, we leave Babylon's ghosts behind and journey west, into jungles where pyramids pierce the canopy, where Maya kings spoke with gods, toward Tikal. Chapter 14. Tikal Maya Jungle Crown. Deep in the Guatemalan rainforest, pyramids rise above the jungle canopy like stone fingers reaching for the sky. From the air, you can see them. Temple IV, the tallest, breaking through the green ocean of trees, 212 feet tall. This was the heart of one of the greatest Maya city-states, a place where kings claimed descent from gods, where priests read the future in the movements of Venus, where warfare and astronomy were equally important. At its peak, around 700 AD, Tikal was home to over 100,000 people. Its influence stretched across the Maya lowlands. Its rulers married into royal families hundreds of miles away, cementing alliances through blood. And then by 900 AD, the city was abandoned. The jungle moved in. Trees grew through plazas. Vines strangled carved stelae. Jaguars prowled through temples where kings once sat. For 1,000 years, Tikal slept beneath the forest, known only to local chicleros, gum tappers, who occasionally stumbled upon stone ruins while harvesting latex from sapodilla trees. Until the 19th century, when reports of vast ruins brought archaeologists pushing through the jungle, machetes in hand. Tikal's story begins around 400 BC, when early settlers built the first platforms and pyramids. But the city's golden age came during what archaeologists call the Classic Period, roughly 250 to 900 AD. This was when Maya civilization reached its height. Cities throughout the lowlands, Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, competed for power and prestige. They fought wars, formed alliances, traded luxury goods over vast distances. And they built. The center of Tikal is dominated by the Great Plaza, surrounded by temples and palaces. Temple I, also called the Temple of the Great Jaguar, rises 144 feet. Built as a tomb for Jasochan Kayawil I, who ruled in the late 7th century, it stands as a perfect example of Maya architectural ambition. Across the plaza, Temple II balances it, built for the king's wife. Husband and wife facing each other for eternity across the stone plaza. Climbing Temple IV is like ascending into the sky. The stairs are steep, designed that way intentionally. You're meant to arrive at the top breathless, humbled. From the summit, you see the rainforest stretching to the horizon in every direction. Other temple pyramids poke through the green, distant, and dreamlike. Life in Tikal during its height was complex and sophisticated. The Maya developed the most advanced writing system in the Americas. Scribes recorded dynastic histories on stone stelae and carved panels. They documented births, marriages, deaths, wars, and astronomical events. In the royal palace, the king, the Kayuhul Ajo, the divine lord, performed bloodletting rituals. He would pierce his tongue or genitals with stingray spines, letting blood fall onto paper that was then burned. The smoke carried his prayers to the gods. This wasn't cruelty, it was communication. The king stood between worlds, human and divine. His blood opened doors. In the markets, commoners traded cacao beans, used as currency, obsidian blades, jade ornaments, colorful feathers from quetzal birds. Women wore huipils woven with intricate patterns. Men painted their bodies for ceremonies. Children learned by watching how to plant maize in the slash-and-burn agricultural fields surrounding the city, how to weave, how to shape clay into pottery, how to read the calendar. The Maya were obsessed with time. They developed two interlocking calendars, the 260-day sacred calendar and the 365-day solar calendar. When the two synced up, marking the completion of a 52-year cycle, it was cause for massive celebration and renewal ceremonies. They tracked Venus with remarkable precision. They knew its cycles better than many modern people do. Venus was war. When it rose as the morning star, it was time to attack enemies. And they did attack. Tikal and Calakmul, the great rival city to the north, fought for supremacy over centuries. Kings were captured, sacrificed, their cities burned. In 562 AD, Tikal suffered a devastating defeat. Calakmul and its allies sacked the city. For over a century, Tikal's power was broken. No major construction, no monuments erected. The dynasty seemed finished. But Jasochan Kayawil I revived the city in the late 600s. He defeated Calakmul, captured their king, sacrificed him. He rebuilt Tikal grander than before, Temple II, the massive Temple IV that still stands as the tallest pre-Columbian structure in the Americas. For another 2 centuries, Tikal thrived. And then came the collapse. It wasn't just Tikal. All across the Maya lowlands, cities were abandoned in the 9th and 10th centuries. The classic Maya civilization effectively ended. Why? Scholars debate this endlessly. Drought played a role. Tree ring data and lake sediments show severe droughts lasting decades. Overpopulation stressed resources. Deforestation led to soil erosion. Wars between city-states never ceased. Perhaps it was all of these things. A perfect storm of environmental and social collapse. The agricultural system couldn't support the population. The people couldn't support the elite. The divine lords lost their divine authority when their bloodletting couldn't bring rain. The end likely came quickly. People abandoned the cities for rural areas. The royal families died out or fled. The priests stopped recording dates on stelae. The last dated monument at Tikal is from 869 AD. After that, silence. The jungle doesn't wait. Within a generation, trees grew in the plazas. Within a century, roots split the stones. Within 500 years, the pyramids were mounds hidden beneath vegetation. The Maya people didn't disappear. Millions still live in the region, speaking Maya languages, practicing traditions rooted in ancient culture. But the cities, those died. When archaeologists began excavating Tikal in the 1950s and 60s, they found a city remarkably preserved by the jungle that buried it. Carved stelae still stood, their inscriptions readable. Palace rooms retained painted murals. Tombs held jade masks, pottery, and sacrificial offerings. Today, Tikal is a national park. You can walk the Great Plaza as kings once did. Climb the temples, though it gets steeper every year as your legs remind you. Touch carved glyphs that record names and dates from 1,300 years ago. But go early, before tourists arrive. Stand in the Great Plaza as dawn light hits Temple I. Listen to the howler monkeys roar in the distance, a sound that hasn't changed since the Maya heard it. In those moments, the dead city feels alive. Tikal reminds us that even the most sophisticated civilizations are vulnerable, that environmental limits are real, that no amount of ritual can overcome ecological collapse. but it also reminds us of human brilliance. The Maya built beauty in harsh conditions. They created art and architecture that endured. They decoded the heavens and recorded history with precision that still astonishes us. The jungle took Tikal back, but couldn't erase it. The stones remain, the story persists. As howler monkeys call to the rising sun and mist burns off the pyramid tops, we leave the Maya jungle behind and journey north, toward another civilization that rose from stone, toward the heart of Africa, toward Great Zimbabwe. Chapter 15. Great Zimbabwe African Stone Echoes. Massive stone walls rise from the African plateau, built without mortar, standing for over 700 years. Walls so impressive that when European colonizers first saw them in the 19th century, they refused to believe Africans built them. They invented elaborate theories. The Phoenicians built it. The Queen of Sheba built it. King Solomon's miners built it. Anyone but the people who actually lived there. It's a familiar story. The refusal to accept that African civilizations could achieve greatness. The insistence that monumental architecture must have come from elsewhere. But Great Zimbabwe was built by the Shona people. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. The radiocarbon dates confirm it. The cultural artifacts prove it. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe controlled vast trade networks stretching from the interior of Africa to the Indian Ocean coast. They traded gold, ivory, and copper for glass beads, porcelain from China, cloth from India. And at the heart of this kingdom stood the city the Shona called Great Zimbabwe, literally houses of stone. The site covers nearly 1,800 acres. At its center rises the Great Enclosure, a massive circular wall over 800 feet in circumference, 30 feet high in places, built from over 1 million granite blocks cut to fit together perfectly. No mortar, just stone on stone, so precisely fitted that the walls have stood for 7 centuries despite earthquakes, rain, and time. Inside the great enclosure stands the conical tower, 30 feet tall, its purpose still debated, a grain storage symbol, a phallic representation of the king's power, a connection to ancestral spirits. No one knows. The tower has no entrance, no interior space. It's solid stone, a monument whose meaning died with those who built it. On the hill above the great enclosure sits the hill complex, where the king and royal family lived. Stone walls wind around massive granite boulders, incorporating the natural rock into the architecture. From here, the king could see for miles across the savannah. Life in Great Zimbabwe during its peak, around 1300 AD, revolved around trade and cattle. The Shona were pastoralists. Cattle represented wealth, status, spiritual connection. The more cattle you owned, the more powerful you were. But they were also sophisticated traders. In excavations, archaeologists found Ming Dynasty porcelain, Persian glass beads, Arabian coins, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. These weren't random items. They were luxury goods acquired through complex trade networks. Gold was Zimbabwe's primary export. The kingdom controlled gold mines throughout the region. Miners extracted ore, smelted it in small furnaces, and shaped it into ingots for trade. The gold traveled east to Kilwa and Sofala on the coast, where Arab and Swahili merchants shipped it across the Indian Ocean. The wealth flowed back as exotic goods that reinforced the king's prestige. In the courtyards within the great enclosure, craftspeople worked. Blacksmiths forged iron tools and weapons. Potters shaped clay into vessels decorated with intricate patterns. Weavers created cotton cloth dyed with local plants. Women carried water in clay pots balanced on their heads. Children tended cattle in the surrounding pastures, learning the songs and stories that connected them to ancestors. Elders sat in the shade of stone walls, settling disputes, maintaining traditions. The king performed rituals that ensured rain, fertility, prosperity. He was the spiritual link between the living and the dead, between earth and sky. His power came not just from wealth but from his ability to maintain cosmic balance. But that balance didn't hold. By 1450, Great Zimbabwe was in decline. The population was dispersing. Construction stopped. The trade networks weakened. Why? Environmental degradation played a role. Supporting a population of perhaps 20,000 people in a relatively small area strained resources. Overgrazing by cattle herds damaged grasslands. Deforestation for building and firewood depleted wood supplies. Salt accumulated in agricultural soils. Climate change may have contributed. Tree ring data suggests droughts in the 15th century. Political factors mattered too. New kingdoms rose to the north, the Mutapa Empire and later the Rozwi Empire. Trade routes shifted. The center of power moved. Great Zimbabwe wasn't destroyed. It was gradually abandoned. People left for other settlements. The royal court relocated. The city that had been the political and spiritual heart of the kingdom became just another place. The stone walls remained, too massive to dismantle, too well-built to collapse. For centuries, local people used the site for ceremonies, recognizing it as an ancestral place of power. But it wasn't inhabited as a city. When European colonizers arrived in the 1890s and saw the ruins, their racism wouldn't allow them to accept African achievement. They looted artifacts. They dug recklessly, destroying archaeological context. They invented pseudo-historical theories to credit anyone but Africans. Zimbabwe Rhodesia, the colonial name, was literally named after these ruins, even as the colonizers denied that black Africans built them. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that proper archaeological work confirmed beyond any doubt that Great Zimbabwe was built by the Shona ancestors of the people still living in the region. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, the new nation took its name from these ruins. The stone bird sculptures found at Great Zimbabwe became the national symbol, appearing on the flag. A reclaiming, a recognition, an acknowledgement that this greatness was theirs. Today, you can walk through the great enclosure. Run your hands along granite blocks fitted so perfectly that you can't slip a blade between them. Climb the hill complex and look out over the same savanna the kings saw. The stones don't explain themselves. They offer no inscriptions, no written history. The Shona oral traditions preserve some memories, but much is lost. Yet the stones speak nonetheless. They say, we built this, we achieved this, we were here. Great Zimbabwe stands as a reminder that African civilizations built greatness long before colonization. That the narrative of Africa as primitive before European arrival is a lie. That stone monuments exist across this continent, built by people whose descendants still walk this land. The walls remain, and the walls remember. As savanna wind whispers through ancient stone and the setting sun paints the walls gold, we leave Africa behind and sail across the Atlantic, toward a brief encounter between worlds, toward the northernmost edge of European expansion into the Americas, toward Eland's ox meadows. Wind fades into ocean waves, the cry of seabirds, the creak of wooden ships. Chapter 16. Eland's aux meadows, Viking New World. Eland's ox meadows. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, where the Gulf of St. Lawrence meets the Atlantic, stand the remains of turf houses that rewrote history. For centuries, the Viking sagas spoke of Vinland, a land across the Western Ocean where Leif Erikson and his crew landed around 1000 AD, where grapes grew wild, where salmon filled the rivers, where the Norse briefly settled before conflict with the indigenous people drove them back to Greenland. Scholars dismissed the sagas as legend. Vikings in North America 500 years before Columbus. Impossible. Until 1960. Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, followed clues in the sagas and local Newfoundland folklore. They searched the coastline until they found raised mounds covered in grass at a place the locals called Meadows, the bay with the meadows. They excavated and found unmistakable evidence of Norse settlement: iron rivets, a bronze pin, a spindle whorl for spinning wool, building techniques identical to those in Iceland and Greenland. The Vikings had reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. The sagas were real. The settlement at Meadows was small. Perhaps 70 to 90 people lived there at its peak. 8 buildings constructed from sod and wood, their walls thick enough to withstand brutal North Atlantic winters. This wasn't a permanent colony. It was a base camp, a jumping-off point for explorations farther south, a place to repair ships, make iron nails, prepare supplies. The largest building served as a great hall, the communal center where the leader lived and everyone gathered for meals. It had multiple rooms, a central hearth, ember pits for keeping fires alive overnight. Smaller buildings served as workshops and dwellings. In one, the Inkstads found evidence of iron smelting, the only known pre-Columbian iron working in the Americas. The Norse were making boat rivets and nails to repair their ships. Life here was harsh. The settlers arrived from Greenland, itself a marginal place, and found Newfoundland not much better. Winters were long and brutal, summers short, the growing season barely sufficient for the crops they knew. But there were resources: timber precious in treeless Greenland, salmon in the rivers, as the sagas said, wild berries, though not grapes. Modern scholars think Vinland might refer to meadowland, not wineland, or grapes found farther south. The Norse felled trees with iron axes, hunted seals and walrus, fished, probably traded with or raided the indigenous people they called Skraelings, the Beothuk and other First Nations peoples who'd lived here for thousands of years. The sagas describe these encounters, sometimes peaceful trade, sometimes violence. One saga tells of a Skraeling bringing furs to trade. Another describes battles, with indigenous warriors using catapults to hurl stones at the Norse. Whether through conflict or simple economics, the Norse decided Vinland wasn't worth the effort. Meadows was occupied for only about a decade, perhaps between 1000 and 1010 AD. Then they left, sailed back to Greenland, told stories of the land across the water, made perhaps a few more voyages, but never established lasting settlements. The turf houses collapsed slowly. Grass grew over them. The Beothuk returned to the area, hunting and fishing as they had before the brief Norse intrusion. For 900 years, the site sat undisturbed, looking like natural mounds. The local people may have known there was something unusual about them, but the knowledge faded. Until Helge and Stein Inkstad proved what the sagas had claimed all along. The discovery fundamentally changed our understanding of history. Columbus wasn't the first European to reach the Americas. The Norse were, by 500 years. But the Norse encounter left almost no lasting impact. They came, stayed briefly, left. They brought no diseases that devastated populations. They established no trade networks. They didn't return in force. In contrast, Columbus's voyage opened the floodgates. Within decades, conquistadors, missionaries, colonizers, and enslaved peoples from Africa would transform both continents forever. The difference? Timing, technology, political will, economic incentive. Columbus arrived when European nations were wealthy enough, technologically advanced enough, and religiously motivated enough to pursue global expansion. The Norse arrived when their own settlements in Greenland were marginal, their ships limited, their population small, and their economic incentives insufficient to justify the risk. So Meadows remains a footnote, a might have been, a reminder that history is shaped not just by who arrives, but by when and why. Today, the site is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Reconstructed turf buildings stand near the archaeological remains, showing what the settlement looked like. Costumed interpreters demonstrate Viking-age crafts, spinning wool, forging iron, cooking over open fires. Stand on that windswept coast and look out at the Atlantic. Imagine dragon-prowed ships appearing over the horizon. Imagine the Norse sailors, exhausted from weeks at sea, rowing toward shore. They were the first Europeans to stand on North American soil. They looked at this new land and decided it wasn't for them. 500 years later, others would come, and they would decide differently, and everything would change. But for this brief moment, around the year 1000, the Norse and the indigenous people encountered each other, traded, fought, then went their separate ways. And the grass grew over the turf houses, hiding the secret of that encounter, until an archaeologist's careful excavation brought it back to light. As Atlantic waves crash against rocky shores and fog rolls in from the sea, we leave the Viking outpost behind and journey across Asia, toward a place where thousands of temples rise from jungle, where kings built monuments to faith that would outlast their kingdom, toward Bagan. Chapter 17. Bagan, Myanmar's Temple Ghosts. Over 2,000 temples rising from the plains of Myanmar. Stupas of red brick, some still gleaming with gold leaf, scattered across 16 square miles like a city of prayer frozen in time. From the air it looks impossible. From the ground, walking among them, it feels like entering a dream. Temple after temple after temple, each one different, each one built with devotion that borders on obsession. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, the rulers and people of the pagan kingdom built over 10,000 Buddhist temples and monasteries on these plains. Of those, over 2,000 survive, the largest concentration of Buddhist temples anywhere on Earth. Why so many? Because building temples earned merit. In Theravada Buddhism, the dominant tradition in Myanmar, merit determines your next rebirth. Building a temple was the surest way to secure a favorable reincarnation. Kings built temples to legitimize their rule and ensure good rebirths. Queens built them. Nobles, merchants, even commoners pooled resources to build them. For 2 centuries, temple construction was the kingdom's primary activity. The Golden Age began with King Anurata, who unified the region in 1044 and made Theravada Buddhism the state religion. He conquered the Mon kingdom to the south, bringing back not just treasure but Buddhist texts, monks, and architects. He built the Shwezigan Pagoda, one of Bagan's most important, housing relics of the Buddha, a tooth and a collarbone. Pilgrims came from across Southeast Asia to pray there. His successors continued building. King Khayansitha constructed the Ananda Temple, Bagan's masterpiece. 4 Buddha statues, each 30 feet tall, face the cardinal directions from within a maze of corridors and chambers. The architecture combines Mon and Indian styles, creating something uniquely Burmese. The temple interiors are cool and dark, a relief from the brutal heat outside. Light filters through small windows, illuminating murals that cover every surface, scenes from the Buddha's life, tales of his previous incarnations, depictions of daily life in 12th century Bagan. Walking through these temples today, you see those murals fading, the plaster crumbling, but enough remains to show the artistry. Figures in flowing robes, elephants and horses, boats on rivers, dancers and musicians. Life in Bagan during its height was prosperous. The kingdom controlled rice-rich agricultural lands along the Irrawaddy River. Trade flowed from China and India. Merchants sold silk, gems, teak wood, lacquerware. In the markets near the riverbank, vendors called out prices in Burmese, Mon, Pali, and Chinese. Monks in saffron robes walked with alms bowls, collecting offerings of rice and vegetables. Children played in the dusty streets between stupas. The royal palace, now long gone because it was built of wood, stood at the city's center. Kings held court, receiving ambassadors, settling disputes, planning new temple constructions. Artisans worked constantly. Brickmakers formed millions of bricks from river clay. Stonemasons carved decorative elements. Painters mixed pigments from minerals and plants. Sculptors cast Buddha images in bronze. Thousands of monks and nuns lived in Bagan's monasteries, studying texts, meditating, teaching children to read and write. Literacy rates were high for a medieval society. Monasteries served as schools. Religious festivals drew crowds. The most important was the full moon of Thadingyut, marking the end of Buddhist Lent. Temples were lit with thousands of oil lamps, turning the plain into a field of stars. But temple building had a cost. Resources poured into construction that could have gone elsewhere. Labor demands were immense. Agricultural production suffered as workers spent time building temples instead of farming. And the temples themselves required maintenance. As more were built, maintaining the existing ones became impossible. Some fell into disrepair within decades of completion. Then came the Mongols. In 1287, Kublai Khan's armies invaded. The pagan kingdom collapsed. The capital was abandoned. The king fled south. But the Mongols didn't destroy the temples. Neither did subsequent rulers. The temples were sacred, protected by religious reverence even through political chaos. What damaged Bagan more than any invasion was time and nature. Earthquakes struck repeatedly. This is a seismically active region. Temples cracked and collapsed. Vegetation grew through walls. Bricks eroded in monsoon rains. By the 19th century, when European travelers first described Bagan, many temples were overgrown ruins. Others were occupied by bats and birds. Some were used by local villagers as storage sheds. The British colonial administration began preservation efforts in the early 20th century. Myanmar's military government continued them, though often crudely. Cement repairs that looked nothing like original brickwork, misguided reconstructions. A major earthquake in 1975 damaged hundreds of temples. Another in 2016 damaged nearly 400 more, toppling spires and cracking walls. Yet over 2,000 temples still stand. You can climb many of them, steep, narrow staircases leading to upper terraces where you can watch the sun rise or set over the temple-studded plain. Those sunsets are legendary. The Irrawaddy River gleams gold. The temples turn from red to orange to purple as light fades. Hot air balloons float overhead, carrying tourists who ooh and ah at the view. But go before dawn, before the tourists. Walk among the temples in first light. Listen to monks chanting morning prayers in those still used for worship. Watch local women carrying offerings of flowers and incense. In those moments, Bagan doesn't feel ruined. It feels alive. A landscape of devotion where merit-making continues, where the faithful still pray to Buddha images carved 8 centuries ago. Bagan reminds us that faith can move mountains, or at least build thousands of temples. That devotion creates beauty that outlasts empires. That what we build in the name of belief, right or wrong, endures longer than what we build for power. As temple bells chime in the wind and morning mist burns off the Irrawaddy, we leave Myanmar's sacred plain behind and travel north, toward another kingdom built on faith, toward the first capital of Siam, toward Sukhothai. Chapter 18, Sukhothai Thai Kingdom in RUNS. The dawn of happiness. That's what the name means in Thai. The first independent Thai kingdom, rising in the 13th century when the Khmer Empire's grip on the region weakened. For about 200 years, Sukhothai was the heart of Thai civilization, a place where art, language, and culture that still define Thailand today took shape. And then it faded, overshadowed by newer kingdoms. The capital moved south. The temples fell silent. Rice paddies reclaimed the land. Today, Sukhothai is a historical park. Ruins scattered across fields and forests. lotus ponds reflecting broken columns, Buddha statues sitting in meditation among the remains of their temples. Beautiful ruins, serene, but ruins nonetheless. The kingdom was founded in 1238 when Thai chieftains rebelled against their Khmer overlords. King Si Inthraphat established the capital at Sukhothai, strategically positioned in the Yam River Valley, with fertile land and good defensive position. But the kingdom's golden age came under King Ramkhamhaeng the Great, who ruled from 1279 to 1298. He expanded the kingdom's territory from the Malay Peninsula to Laos. He established diplomatic relations with China and the Khmer Empire. Most importantly, he invented, or at least standardized, the Thai alphabet, adapting scripts from Khmer and Mon sources. An inscription he commissioned in 1292 is considered the oldest surviving example of written Thai. That inscription describes Sukhothai in glowing terms. In the time of King Ramkhamhaeng, this land of Sukhothai is thriving. In the water there are fish, in the fields there is rice. The lord of the realm does not levy taxes on the people. If any commoner has a complaint or grievance, they go and strike the bell that the king has hung there. A bell by the palace gate. Any citizen could ring it and the king would personally hear their grievance. Democratic, not exactly, but progressive for the 13th century. The kingdom prospered on rice agriculture and trade. Sukhothai was positioned on trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean to China. Merchants brought Indian cotton, Chinese porcelain, and precious stones from across Southeast Asia. Sukhothai's artisans developed a distinctive style of Buddha image that remains the Thai ideal, the walking Buddha, captured mid-stride, one hand raised in blessing. The figure conveys grace, movement, spiritual lightness. These statues were cast in bronze using the lost wax technique. First, artisans carved a wax model. Then they coated it in clay. When fired, the wax melted out, leaving a mold into which molten bronze was poured. The results were stunning. Walking Buddhas that seemed to float above the earth. Serene faces that captured enlightenment's peace. Works of art that were also objects of devotion. The kingdom built temple after temple. Wat Mahathat, the spiritual center, housed a massive Chedi stupa, surrounded by smaller satellite Chedis and Viharn assembly halls. Over 200 subordinate temples surrounded it. Wat Si Chum contained a huge seated Buddha, 45 feet tall, squeezed into a narrow chamber called a mandap. When you enter and look up, the Buddha's serene face fills your vision, overwhelming, peaceful. Wat Sa Si sat on an island in a lotus-filled pond, accessible only by a walking bridge. Imagine monks crossing that bridge at dawn to perform rituals, their reflections rippling in the water. Life in Sukhothai followed seasonal rhythms. During the rainy season, rice paddies flooded. Farmers transplanted rice seedlings, working knee-deep in water. The kingdom's prosperity depended on these harvests. Children learned to swim almost before they could walk. Water was everywhere. Rivers, ponds, canals flooded fields. Life adapted to it, incorporated it. Festivals marked the agricultural calendar. Loi Krathong, still celebrated in Thailand, began in Sukhothai, floating lotus-shaped boats made of banana leaves, bearing candles and incense, down rivers and streams as offerings to the water spirits. Buddhist monks lived in monasteries attached to the temples. They taught children to read and write, passing on religious texts and cultural knowledge. Becoming a monk, even temporarily, was expected of young men. But Sukhothai's golden age was brief. By the late 14th century, a new power was rising to the south, the Ayutthaya kingdom. Larger, wealthier, better positioned for trade with the sea. In 1378, Ayutthaya forced Sukhothai into vassalage. By 1438, Sukhothai was fully absorbed. The capital moved to Ayutthaya. The temples at Sukhothai continued to function, but royal patronage ended. Without maintenance, the temples began to deteriorate. Roofs collapsed, Walls cracked. Vegetation moved in. The walking Buddhas continued to meditate among the ruins, undisturbed by the kingdom's decline. For centuries, Sukhothai was just another abandoned city. Local villages existed among the ruins. Farmers planted rice in fields where markets once stood. Buddhist monks still used some temples, but most fell silent. It wasn't until the 1970s that the Thai government, with UNESCO support, began serious restoration. The Sukhothai Historical Park was established, preserving the central zone of ruins. Today, it's one of Thailand's most visited historical sites. Tourists rent bicycles and ride between temple ruins. They photograph the walking Buddhas at golden hour when the light is perfect. They feed the fish in the lotus ponds and marvel at the serene atmosphere. It's peaceful now. Too peaceful, perhaps. The ruins are so well maintained, so manicured, that they feel more like a theme park than the heart of a lost kingdom. But go during the week, when fewer tourists visit. Sit beside the giant Buddha at Wat Si Chum as afternoon light slants through the narrow opening. Or stand at the edge of the lotus pond at Wat Sa Si as the sun sets, turning the water gold. In those moments you can almost hear them. The bells ringing for evening prayers, the chanting of monks, the splash of children playing in the canals, the rhythmic pounding of rice being milled. Sukhothai reminds us that happiness, even kingdoms named for it, is fleeting, that golden ages shine briefly before fading into memory, that what survives is art and faith, not power. The walking Buddhas still walk, even though the kingdom that created them is dust. The lotus ponds still bloom, even though the poets who praised them are forgotten. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps beauty and serenity matter more than the names of kings. As evening descends over the ruins and bats emerge from temple eaves to hunt insects over lotus-filled ponds, we leave Sukhothai behind and travel west across mountains, toward another Hindu kingdom that rose and fell, toward the last great empire of South India, toward Hampi. Chapter 19. Hampi Vijayanagara's Fallen Glory. The name sounds almost gentle, but the ruins spread across 16 square miles tell a story of staggering grandeur and terrible violence. This was Vijayanagara, city of victory, capital of the last great Hindu empire in South India. At its peak in the 16th century, it was one of the richest cities in the world. Its markets filled with diamonds, pearls, silk, and spices. Its rulers commanded armies that held back Islamic sultanates from the north for 2 centuries. And then in 1565, in a single catastrophic battle, it all ended. The city was sacked, burned, smashed, never to recover. Today, Hampi is a landscape of ruins so vast you need days to explore them. Temple complexes with intricately carved pillars, royal structures with sophisticated water systems, markets where merchants once sold treasures, all of it scattered among otherworldly rock formations, massive granite boulders balanced impossibly on each other, shaped by erosion into surreal sculptures. The Tungabhadra River curves through the site, its waters still flowing as they did when the empire thrived. Vijayanagara was founded in 1336 by 2 brothers, Harappa and Bukka, who established it as a defensive bulwark against Islamic expansion from the north. The Delhi Sultanate and later the Deccan Sultanates controlled much of India, but Vijayanagara held the south. For over 200 years, the empire grew in wealth and power. It controlled the spice trade. It mined diamonds and exported them through coastal ports. It patronized art, literature, music, and temple construction on a massive scale. The most famous ruler was Krishnadevara, who reigned from 1509 to 1529. Under him, Vijayanagara reached its zenith. He expanded the empire's territory through military conquest. He commissioned massive building projects. He wrote poetry in Telugu and Sanskrit. Foreign visitors were stunned by the city's wealth. A Portuguese traveler, Domingo Pires, described markets with dedicated streets for different goods, one for jewels, one for horses, one for textiles. He described the king's processions with thousands of soldiers, elephants draped in gold cloth and courtesans dancing. The Vitala temple complex, built during Krishnadevaraya's reign, exemplifies Hampi's architectural achievement. Its famous stone chariot is carved from a single rock, so detailed it looks like it could roll away. Its musical pillars, when tapped, produce distinct musical notes, each pillar tuned differently. The main hall's pillars are carved with incredible intricacy, rearing horses, warriors in battle poses, mythological scenes. Every surface is art. The Virupaksha temple, dedicated to Shiva, still functions as a living temple. Pilgrims come to worship as they have for centuries. Inside, the sanctum is dark, the air thick with incense. Outside, monkeys play in the courtyards, stealing offerings from inattentive visitors. Life in Vijayanagara was cosmopolitan. Hindu, Muslim, and Christian merchants traded side by side. The empire practiced religious tolerance, unusual for the era. Muslims served in the army and administration. The royal stables, still standing, show Islamic architectural influence. In the royal quarters, queens lived in pavilions cooled by sophisticated water channels. The Lotus Mahal, a two-story structure combining Hindu and Islamic styles, provided a retreat from the heat. Aqueducts brought water from distant dams. The king's balance was used during festivals. The king would be weighed against gold, gems, or grain, which was then distributed to Brahmins and the poor, a display of wealth and generosity. Bazaars stretch for miles. The jewel market alone was said to be longer than modern city blocks. Diamonds from the kingdom's mines, including the Golconda mines, source of the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, were sold alongside pearls from the coast. Artists and musicians lived in the empire's patronage. Dancers trained in the complex Bharatanatyam style performed in temples. Poets composed epic verses in Kannada, Telugu, and Sanskrit. But the empire's wealth attracted envy, and its power attracted enemies. In 1565, the four Deccan sultanates, longtime rivals who usually fought each other, united for a single purpose: destroying Vijayanagara. At the Battle of Talikota, the empire's army met the combined sultanate forces. Vijayanagara's army was massive, but the sultanates had superior cavalry and artillery. The battle was a disaster. The empire's forces were routed. The sultan's armies pursued the fleeing soldiers all the way back to the capital. What followed was systematic destruction. For months, the sultanate armies sacked Vijayanagara. They smashed temples, toppled statues, broke pillars. They burned the markets and palaces. They looted everything portable. They wanted to ensure Vijayanagara could never rise again. They succeeded. The royal family fled. The population scattered to villages. The great capital became ruins almost overnight. In the following decades, local rulers tried to maintain some structures, but the empire was finished. By the 17th century, Hampi was abandoned, its temples silent, its markets empty. The jungle didn't reclaim it. This is a dry region. But time and erosion did their work. Pillars fell, roofs collapsed, carving weathered. Yet even in ruin, Hampi is magnificent. The scale of it, the artistry, the ambition. Walk through the Vitala temple complex in late afternoon. Light slants through carved pillars, throwing intricate shadows. The musical pillars hum faintly in the wind. Boulders balance overhead like frozen giants. Or sit by the Tungabhadra River at sunset. The water reflects the ruins on the far bank, temples and pavilions turning gold, then orange, then purple as day fades. You can almost see them. The processions of elephants, the dancers performing in temple courtyards, the merchants haggling in the bazaar, the king being weighed against gold while crowds cheer. Hampi reminds us that empires fall. that no amount of wealth or art or military power guarantees permanence, that destruction can be swift when it comes. But it also reminds us that beauty survives brutality, that even broken, these temples inspire awe, that ruins can teach more than intact monuments because they show us not just what was built, but what was lost. As the river flows past ancient ghats where priests once performed rituals, and the granite boulders glow in fading light, we leave Hampi behind and travel northwest, toward another Indus Valley civilization site, toward Mohenjo-Daro's forgotten twin, toward Harappa. Chapter 20, Harappa the Forgotten Twin. When people think of the Indus Valley civilization, they usually think of Mohenjo-Daro, the more famous site, the better preserved, the one with dramatic photographs of ancient streets and bath houses. But Harappa came first, at least its discovery did. In the 1850s, British engineers building railways across colonial India needed ballast for the tracks. They found ancient mounds near the Ravi River in Punjab, perfect source of bricks. They didn't know they were destroying one of the world's oldest civilizations. They just saw free building materials. Thousands of ancient bricks were crushed and used for railway construction. Priceless artifacts were scattered or destroyed. Entire structures vanished under British efficiency. It wasn't until the 1920s that archaeologists realized what had been lost. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were twin capitals of a civilization that rivaled ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. A civilization that flourished from roughly 3300 to 1300 BC, over 2,000 years. By then, much of Harappa was gone. The railway damage was irreversible. What remains today is a fraction of what existed. But that fraction tells an extraordinary story. The Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization, was unlike its contemporaries. No massive palaces or temples have been found, no royal tombs filled with gold, no massive walls or fortifications. Instead, standardization, urban planning, obsessive attention to sanitation and measurement. The cities were laid out on precise grids, streets ran straight and intersected at right angles. Houses were built to uniform standards, with private wells and bathrooms connected to sophisticated drainage systems. In fact, the drainage systems might be the civilization's most impressive achievement. Covered sewers ran under every street, with manholes for maintenance. Waste water from houses flowed into these drains, which emptied into larger sewers, which carried everything out of the city. This level of urban sanitation wouldn't be matched in Europe until the 19th century, over 3,000 years later. The cities show evidence of a powerful central authority that could enforce building codes and maintain infrastructure. But we don't know what form that authority took. No palaces clearly stand out. No royal inscriptions boast of conquests. Perhaps power was distributed differently. Perhaps priests ruled. Perhaps merchants. Perhaps some form of collective governance. We don't know because we can't read their writing. The Harappans left thousands of small inscriptions, mostly on stone seals used to mark goods for trade. But the script remains undeciphered. Only about 400 different signs exist, suggesting it might be logographic rather than alphabetic. But without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, it stays mysterious. Those seals are fascinating. Small squares of steatite carved with animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, and short inscriptions. They were probably pressed into wax or clay to mark ownership or authenticity of goods. The most famous seal shows a seated figure surrounded by animals. Some scholars think it's an early form of the god Shiva, others disagree. Without the text translated, we're just guessing. Life in Harappa around 2500 BC was surprisingly comfortable by ancient standards. Houses were made of fired brick, not mud brick that would erode quickly, but properly fired clay brick that could last centuries. Most houses had private bathrooms with drains. Some had separate bathing platforms. Water was drawn from wells that still exist, some over 30 feet deep, lined with brick. The city had public buildings whose function remains unclear. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro suggests ritual bathing was important. Similar structures probably existed at Harappa, though they were destroyed before proper excavation. Craftspeople produced standardized weights and measures, remarkably precise. A weight unit of about 28 grams was used throughout the civilization's territory, spanning over 1 million square kilometers. This suggests extensive trade networks and sophisticated commercial organization. Harappan traders reached Mesopotamia. Sumerian texts mention a place called Meluha that scholars believe was the Indus Valley. Harappan seals have been found in Mesopotamian cities. Trade goods included cotton textiles, carnelian beads, ivory, timber. In return, Mesopotamian goods flowed back metals, semi-precious stones, ideas. But unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Harappan civilization left no monumental art, no massive statues of kings, no tomb paintings. The famous dancing girl bronze figurine from Mohenjo-Daro is only 4 inches tall. Their art was small-scale, personal, refined, jewelry, seals, small sculptures, decorated pottery. This suggests different values. Perhaps displays of wealth and power weren't culturally important, or perhaps religious beliefs discouraged monumentalism. We can only speculate. What ended the Harappan civilization? For years, scholars blamed invasion by Aryans, the Indo-European peoples who moved into the region around 1500 BC. The theory was convenient for colonial narratives, a superior civilizing force conquering a decadent urban culture. But archaeological evidence doesn't support this. There's no evidence of mass violence, no layer of destruction, no sudden change. Instead, climate change. The Gagar-Hakra River system, a major waterway that fed the region, began drying up around 1900 BC. Monsoons weakened. Agriculture became difficult. People gradually abandoned the cities and moved east toward the Ganges Valley, where water was more reliable. Harappa and other cities slowly emptied over centuries, not years. By 1300 BC, the great urban centers were ghost towns, but the people didn't vanish. Their descendants continued in smaller, rural settlements. Their genes persist in modern South Asian populations. Their languages probably contributed to later Indo-Aryan languages. The civilization transformed rather than died. Today, Harappa is a protected archaeological site, though much damage is irreversible. You can see the foundations of the granary, a massive structure for storing grain. You can walk streets laid out 45 centuries ago. You can see wells that still hold water. But you have to use your imagination to rebuild what the railway destroyed, to see houses where only foundations remain, to populate empty streets with ancient merchants and craftspeople. Harappa reminds us that civilizations can be lost twice, once when they fall, and again when we destroy what remains before understanding its value. It reminds us that we're still learning, that new discoveries might yet unlock the script, reveal the social structure, explain the mysteries. And it reminds us that sophistication takes many forms, that drainage systems can be as impressive as pyramids, that urban planning can be as significant as conquest, that a civilization without kings or temples can still be great. As wind blows across the excavated mounds and peacocks call in the distance, we leave Harappa behind and journey south, toward legend and longing, toward a city that inspired myths across the Islamic world, toward Ubar. Chapter 21. Ubar, Arabian City of the Genie. The Atlantis of the Sands, the city mentioned in the Quran and Arabian Nights, the legendary capital of a wealthy frankincense-trading kingdom destroyed by God for its people's arrogance. For centuries, scholars debated whether Ubar even existed. Was it real, or just another mythical city like Shangri-La or El Dorado? In the 1980s, a team led by filmmaker Nicholas Clapp and archaeologist Juris Zarins decided to find out. They used something unprecedented in archaeology: satellite imagery and NASA technology. They studied caravan routes, ancient texts, and Landsat images. They found traces of ancient roads converging on a spot in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the harshest deserts on Earth. In 1992, they excavated, and they found it. Not a golden city with minarets and palaces, but a fortress, a trading post, towers and walls built around a limestone cavern that provided water in the middle of the desert. It was real. Ubar, or Iram of the Pillars, as the Quran calls it, existed from roughly 2800 BC until about 300 AD. For 3,000 years, it was a crucial stop on the frankincense trade route. Frankincense was one of the ancient world's most valuable commodities, an aromatic resin from Boswellia trees that grew only in southern Arabia and Somalia, burned in temples from Egypt to Rome, essential for religious ceremonies, worth its weight in gold. Ubar controlled the wells that made crossing the empty quarter possible. Caravans traveling from the frankincense groves in Dhofar to markets in Petra, Gaza, and Damascus had to stop here, had to pay for water, had to trade. The fortress was small by city standards, perhaps a few hundred permanent residents, but during trading season, thousands of camels would converge here, their loads of frankincense guarded by armed traders. The towers would have been visible from miles away, the only vertical structures in an endless flat landscape. Approaching them must have felt like approaching salvation after days in the desert. Inside the walls, merchants haggled. Water was carefully rationed. Camels were fed and watered. Goods were redistributed. Smaller caravans joined larger ones for safety in the next leg of the journey. This was Ubar's wealth, not production but position, not what it made but what it controlled. The legends surrounding Ubar speak of excessive pride. The Quran mentions the people of Ad, who built Iram with lofty pillars, and who were destroyed for rejecting their prophet and worshipping false gods. The Arabian Nights describes it as a city of vast wealth and sophisticated wickedness, buried under sand as divine punishment. Did something dramatic happen? The archaeological evidence suggests yes. Ubar was built over a limestone cavern, the source of its precious water. Over centuries, that cavern was hollowed out further by water erosion. The fortress sat on increasingly unstable ground. Around 300 AD, the cavern collapsed. The fortress sank partially into the earth. The walls cracked. The towers fell. And without water, Ubar was useless. The trade routes shifted. The caravans found other wells. The fortress was abandoned. Sand buried it. Within generations, it vanished from sight. Only the legends remained. Modern archaeologists found evidence of the collapse. Walls tilted at crazy angles. Structures pulled down into the earth. The limestone cavern visible below the ruins. Nature destroyed Ubar, but the legends transformed that into divine judgment. Perhaps because Ubar represented something disturbing: wealth without production, prosperity built on controlling what others need, power without creation. The fortress produced nothing, grew nothing, made nothing. It simply sat on top of water and demanded payment for access. And when the ground literally gave way beneath it, people saw moral judgment in geological accident. Today, Ubar is a small archaeological site in southern Oman. The ruins are modest: broken walls, pottery shards, traces of the collapsed cavern, nothing like the golden city of legend. Tourists occasionally visit, though it's difficult to reach. The empty quarter is still empty, still harsh, still dangerous without proper preparation. Standing at Ubar, surrounded by endless sand dunes, you understand why legends grew around it. This place feels mythical. The silence is absolute. The horizon extends forever in every direction. Heat rises in visible waves. That anyone built anything here seems impossible. That it became wealthy seems absurd. That it's now forgotten seems inevitable. Ubar reminds us that legends often have roots in reality, even when exaggerated. Cities built on monopolizing resources are vulnerable. That nature doesn't care about human ambition. And it reminds us that the desert keeps secrets. How many other lost cities lie beneath the sand, their locations forgotten, their names surviving only in distorted legends? As sand hisses across the ruins and the sun beats down on empty desert, we leave Arabia behind and travel north, toward another legendary city, one that supposedly sank not into sand but into water, toward Russia's wholly vanished city, toward Kitezh. Chapter 22. Kitezh, Russia's sunken holy city. Russia's invisible city, the city that God saved by making it disappear. According to legend, Kitezh was a holy city near Lake Svetloar in central Russia. When Mongol invaders approached in the 13th century, the people prayed for deliverance. God answered by making the city sink into the lake, taking it beyond the reach of destruction. The Mongols arrived to find only water where a city should have been, ripples on the surface, perhaps the faint sound of bells ringing beneath the waves. Kitezh became Russia's spiritual refuge, a place that exists but cannot be reached by the unworthy, a city waiting for the faithful, visible only to those pure of heart. It's Russia's Atlantis, its Brigadoon, its never-never land. But is any of it real? The legend appears in Russian texts from the 15th century onward, particularly in the Kitezh Chronicle, a religious tale about Prince Yuri Vsevolodovich and his flight from the Mongol invasion. In 1237, the Mongol horde under Badu Khan swept into Russia. City after city fell. Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, all burned. The princes who resisted were killed. Prince Yuri founded two cities, according to legend, Little Kitezh and Great Kitezh. Little Kitezh fell to the Mongols, but Great Kitezh, hidden on the shores of Lake Svetloar, was saved by miracle. The Mongols captured a man from Little Kitezh and tortured him until he revealed Great Kitezh's location. They marched on the city, expecting easy conquest. But the people of Kitezh refused to defend themselves with weapons. They prayed instead. They gathered in the cathedral, singing hymns as the Mongols approached. And then the miracle happened. Springs burst forth around the city. Water rose rapidly. The city began to sink, descending into the earth, covered by water that formed Lake Svetloar. The Mongols could only watch as their prize vanished. Some said they saw the golden domes of churches disappearing beneath the surface. Others said they heard bells ringing from underwater. The city wasn't destroyed, it was preserved, hidden, waiting. Kitezh became a powerful symbol in Russian spirituality. It represented the true Russia, holy, pure, uncorrupted by foreign invasion. A Russia that existed on a spiritual plane, beyond the reach of worldly violence. Old Believers, Russian Orthodox Christians who rejected church reforms in the 17th century, adopted Kitezh as their ideal, a place where true faith survived untainted. Some claim to have seen it or heard its bells. Pilgrims began traveling to Lake Svetloar. They walked its shores looking for signs. They listened for bells beneath the waves. They left offerings and prayed for visions. Lake Svetloar itself is real, a small, nearly circular lake in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. It's unusually deep for its size and has no visible inflow or outflow streams, fed instead by underwater springs. The water is remarkably clear. On calm days you can see deep down, and it's easy to imagine or believe you see something down there. Shapes that might be walls, shadows that might be buildings. Scientific surveys have found nothing. No ruins, no evidence of any settlement at the lake bottom. But believers aren't swayed by sonar scans. They know what they hear. They know what they feel. For them, Kitezh exists on a spiritual level that science can't measure. It's a matter of faith, not archaeology. The story of Kitezh inspired artists. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov wrote an opera about it, The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitezh. The music captures the mystical atmosphere, bells ringing, water rising, the city fading into legend. Soviet authorities hated the legend. It represented religious faith, spiritual resistance, the idea of a true Russia beyond communist reach. They discouraged pilgrimages, they mocked believers. But the legend persisted. Even under atheist rule, people found their way to Lake Svetlyar. They looked into the water. They listened. After the Soviet Union fell, pilgrimage revived. Today, thousands visit the lake annually. They walk barefoot around it, a 3-kilometer circuit considered sacred. They bathe in its waters, believing them holy. Some still claim to hear bells, especially on quiet summer evenings when mist rises from the lake. They say if you're pure of heart, you can hear the city's church bells ringing vespers. Is Kitezh real? Probably not as described. The Mongol invasion of 1238 is historical fact. Prince Yuri died fighting them. Many cities were destroyed. But there's no historical record of a city called Kitezh, no archaeological evidence, no contemporary accounts. Yet the legend feels true on a different level. The Mongol invasion was traumatic for medieval Russia. Cities did vanish, destroyed so completely that sometimes even their locations were forgotten. Perhaps Kitezh represents all those lost cities, all the things the Mongols destroyed, all the innocence and holiness that violence took away. Perhaps it's a collective memory transformed into myth, a wish that somewhere, somehow, the good and beautiful were preserved. That destruction wasn't total, that something holy survived, waiting to be rediscovered when the world becomes worthy again. Standing at Lake Svetlyar, especially at dawn or dusk when mist softens the edges of reality, it's easy to understand the legend's power. The water is still, the forest around it is quiet, the lake is so perfectly round it seems artificial. The depth and clarity create an optical illusion. You feel like you could see to the bottom, and yet you can't. And in that space between seeing and not seeing, between knowing and believing, legends live. Kitezh reminds us that not all lost cities are physical places. Some exist in imagination and faith. Some survive not in stone but in story. And perhaps that's a more powerful form of survival. Atlantis might be ruins on a seabed, but Kitezh is an ideal, forever uncorrupted, forever waiting, forever just out of reach. As mist rises from Lake Svetlyar and evening bells ring from a distant monastery, we leave this invisible city behind and journey west, across mountains and time, toward cliff dwellings carved into impossible canyon walls, toward the Anasazi shadows, toward Cliff Palace. Chapter 23, Cliff Palace, Anasazi Canyon, SHADOWS. Tucked into an alcove in the canyon walls of Mesa Verde, Colorado, sits the largest cliff dwelling in North America. 150 rooms and 23 kivas, circular ceremonial chambers, built directly into the rock face, protected by the overhanging cliff. From a distance, it looks like it grew there. Stone rooms stacked against stone walls, blending into the canyon itself. Only the T-shaped doorways and the geometric precision of the masonry reveal human hands. The ancestral Pueblones, formerly called Anasazi, built this between 1190 and 1260 AD. For less than a century, they lived here, raising children, storing grain, performing ceremonies, living lives in stone rooms suspended between canyon floor and mesa top. And then they left. Not slowly, not gradually, but rapidly, within a generation or two, abandoning Mesa Verde and the surrounding region entirely. Why they left is one of North American archaeology's enduring mysteries. The ancestral Pueblones had lived in the Four Corners region, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, for centuries before building the cliff dwellings. They started as hunter-gatherers, then developed agriculture, growing corn, beans, and squash in mesa-top fields. For generations, they lived on the mesa tops in pit houses, then in above-ground pueblos made of stone and adobe. Then, around 1150 AD, they began moving into the cliffs. Not all of them, many continued living on the mesa tops, but significant populations relocated to these alcoves, building elaborate dwellings in what seemed like defensive or at least easily defendable positions. Cliff Palace was the grandest. Up to 100 people may have lived there at its peak. The construction required immense labor, quarrying sandstone blocks, carrying them to the site, shaping them with stone tools, mortaring them with adobe. They built four-story towers. They plastered walls and painted them. They dug kivas deep into the alcove floor, sacred spaces where men gathered for ceremonies, their exact nature now unknown. Water was the constant challenge. The alcoves had no springs. Residents had to carry every drop from springs on the canyon floor or catch rainwater. In a region that receives only about 18 inches of rain per year, water management was critical. They carved toeholds into the cliff faces, tiny handholds and footholds, to create trails up and down the canyons. Women climbed these trails daily, carrying water jars with children strapped to their backs. Imagine that life, waking in a stone room as dawn light hits the opposite canyon wall, climbing down rough trails to fetch water, tending crops on the mesa above, grinding corn on stone metates, weaving baskets and blankets, raising children in rooms with T-shaped windows framing views of the canyon. The communal aspects must have been central. With everyone living so close together, sharing space in the alcove, cooperation wasn't optional. Conflicts had to be resolved quickly, resources shared carefully. The kivas provided spaces for ceremony and community. Here, the men gathered to prepare for ceremonies, to make decisions, to pass down stories and knowledge to the younger generation. But what stories? What beliefs? We don't know. The ancestral Pueblones left no written records, only their buildings, their pottery, their rock art. Modern Pueblo people, descendants of the ancestral Pueblones, have oral traditions, but they're careful about what they share with outsiders. Sacred knowledge is sacred. Not everything is meant to be public. What we do know is that by 1285 AD, Cliff Palace and the other Mesa Verde dwellings were abandoned. The people left behind pottery, tools, even some food stores. They didn't take everything. This wasn't leisurely relocation. This was departure, possibly hurried. The people migrated south and east, joining existing pueblos or establishing new ones along the Rio Grande and in what's now New Mexico and Arizona. Their descendants became the modern Pueblo peoples, Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and others. But Mesa Verde was left empty. The cliff dwellings stood silent. Wind whistled through vacant rooms. Dust accumulated in kivas. For 600 years, the cliff dwellings were known only to local Native Americans, who considered the sites sacred, places of their ancestors, not to be disturbed. Then, in 1888, two cowboys searching for lost cattle in winter snowstorms stumbled across Cliff Palace. They were the first non-native people to document it. Word spread, tourists arrived, looters followed, priceless artifacts were carried off, pottery smashed, rooms disturbed. Not until 1906, when President Theodore Roosevelt designated Mesa Verde a national park, did protection begin. Today, Cliff Palace is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the American Southwest. Rangers lead tour, explaining the architecture, the lifestyle, the mystery of abandonment. But the site resists simple explanation. You can learn the facts, dates, construction techniques, population estimates. But standing in the alcove, looking at the rooms built into the cliff, you feel the weight of unanswered questions. Why did they build here in such a difficult location? Defense, spiritual reasons, simple pragmatism. The alcoves provided shelter from sun and snow. What ceremonies happened in the kivas? What prayers did they offer? Did they know at the end that they were leaving forever? The silence of the abandoned rooms is profound, not peaceful, haunting. These were homes, families lived here, children played in these courtyards, women ground corn in these rooms, men gathered in these kivas. And then it was empty. The everyday objects left behind suggest they meant to return, but they never did. Cliff Palace reminds us that environmental limits are real, that civilizations can't outlast their resource base, that droughts don't care about cultural achievements. But it also reminds us that people are resilient. The ancestral Pueblones didn't disappear. They adapted, they moved, they survived. Their descendants still live in the Southwest, still practice ceremonies rooted in ancient traditions, still remember, in ways outsiders can only glimpse, what it means to belong to this harsh, beautiful land. As wind echoes through the empty rooms and ravens circle overhead, we leave the canyon shadows behind and journey south, across the border into Africa, toward another stone city whose builders are sometimes forgotten, toward Khami ruins. Chapter 24, Khami, Zimbabwe's Forgotten Gold. The name is less famous than Great Zimbabwe, the ruins less visited, the history less known. But for over 2 centuries, Khami was the capital of the Torwa state, the kingdom that succeeded Great Zimbabwe as the dominant power in what's now western Zimbabwe. When Great Zimbabwe was abandoned around 1450, the center of power shifted west. The Torwa people established their capital at Khami, about 20 miles from modern-day Bulawayo. And they built something remarkable. Khami's architecture is more sophisticated than Great Zimbabwe's. The stone walls feature decorative patterns, chevrons, check patterns, herringbone designs, created by carefully arranging differently colored stones. The platforms and terraces show more advanced engineering. This wasn't primitive building. This was refinement, evolution. The builders took what had been learned at Great Zimbabwe and improved it. The site covers about 3 square miles. Stone-walled platforms rise in tiers up the hillsides. The largest complex, the hill ruins, served as the royal residence. Below it, other platforms held residences of nobles and important functionaries. Commoners lived in the valley in huts made of mud and thatch. Only the elite lived in stone. This was a hierarchical society. The king, the Mambo, ruled with both political and spiritual authority. He controlled trade, particularly in gold. He mediated between the living and the ancestors. He performed rituals to ensure rain and fertility. Gold was Khami's wealth, as it had been Great Zimbabwe's. The kingdom controlled gold mines throughout the region. Miners extracted ore, smelted it in small furnaces, and shaped it into ingots for trade. But Khami's golden age coincided with new arrivals on the African coast, the Portuguese. In the early 1500s, Portuguese traders established posts on the Mozambique coast. They wanted African gold. They wanted to bypass Muslim middlemen and trade directly with the interior kingdoms. The Torwa state obliged. Gold flowed from Khami to the coast. Portuguese goods, cloth, beads, Chinese porcelain flowed back. In the ruins today, archaeologists have found Ming Dynasty porcelain, Portuguese trade beads, and cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, evidence of a globalized trading network centered on African gold. Life in Khami during its peak, around 1550 AD, centered on the royal court. The Mambo lived on the highest platform, his compound surrounded by decorated stone walls. His wives lived in separate quarters. His courtiers occupied lower platforms, their positions literally reflected in their elevation. Below in the valley, craftspeople worked. Blacksmiths forged iron tools. Goldsmiths created ornaments and trade goods. Potters shaped clay vessels. Weavers made cotton cloth. Women tended fields of millet and sorghum. Cattle were herded on surrounding grasslands, wealth on the hoof, as in most African societies. The more cattle a man owned, the wealthier he was. Markets bustled with trade. Locally produced goods exchanged for exotic imports, salt from distant mines, copper from the north, glass beads that sparkled in the sun. Religious ceremonies punctuated the year. The Mambo performed rituals at sacred sites, caves and rock shelters where ancestors were venerated. These weren't public spectacles. They were intimate connections between ruler and spiritual realm, maintaining the cosmic order. But that order was fragile. In the early 1600s, a new power rose to the north, the Razwi Empire, led by the legendary ruler Changamayar Dambo. The Razwi were militarily superior, with better organization and tactics. They conquered the Torwa state. The Mambo was killed or fled. Khami was sacked. But unlike the violent destruction of Vijayanagara, Khami wasn't burned or systematically destroyed. It was simply abandoned as the capital. The Razwi established their own centers of power elsewhere. Khami's stone walls remained standing, the decorative patterns still visible, but the people left. The compound became ruins. Over centuries, vegetation grew. Trees pushed through walls. Grass covered platforms. The site returned to bush, known only to local herders who grazed cattle there. British colonizers in the late 1800s heard rumors of ruins. They explored and, like at Great Zimbabwe, refused to believe Africans had built such sophisticated structures. They invented theories. Arabs built it, Phoenicians, Jews, anyone but the ancestors of the people living there. This colonial racism delayed serious archaeological study for decades. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that proper excavation began. What researchers found confirmed indigenous African origin. The pottery styles, building techniques, and cultural artifacts all linked to the Shona people. Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, throwing off colonial rule and the racist ideology that came with it. Khami, like Great Zimbabwe, became a symbol of African achievement. Today, Khami is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though it receives far fewer visitors than Great Zimbabwe. The ruins are peaceful, less restored, more raw. You can walk the platforms and see the decorative stone patterns still clear after 500 years. You can stand where the Mambo stood, looking out over the valley. You can touch walls built by hands connected to the people still living in this region. The Portuguese trade beads scattered in the soil remind us that Khami was part of a global economy, that African kingdoms weren't isolated backwaters but active participants in world trade. The decorated walls remind us that African architecture was sophisticated, artistic, advanced. And the quiet ruins remind us that even kingdoms fall, that power shifts, that what seems permanent is temporary. But the stones remain, and the descendants of the builders remain, and the memory, finally freed from colonial distortion, remains. Khami stands not as a forgotten place, but as a reclaimed heritage, a reminder that African history is deep, complex, and impressive, that the narrative of a dark continent waiting for European enlightenment is a lie. The gold flowed from here, the trade network stretched from here, the builders lived here. And their stones still stand, decorated with patterns that catch the light, just as they did 500 years ago when Khami was a capital, not a ruin. As savanna wind whispers through stone passages and evening shadows lengthen across the platforms, we leave Khami behind and prepare for the next chapters of our journey. But those stories will wait for another night. Chapter 25. Chaco Canyon, Puebloan Star Roads. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, massive stone buildings rise from the canyon floor. Not cliff dwellings like Mesa Verde, but freestanding structures. Great houses that reach 4 and 5 stories high, containing hundreds of rooms. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, has over 600 rooms and 40 kivas. Its walls are perfectly aligned to cardinal directions. Its masonry is so precise that thousand-year-old walls still stand, their stones fitted without mortar. But here's the mystery. Chaco Canyon is a terrible place to build a city. The soil is poor, water is scarce, the growing season is short, timber for construction had to be carried from forests 50 miles away. Every aspect of life here required immense effort and coordination. Yet between 850 and 1150 AD, the ancestral Puebloans built not just one great house, but a dozen. They engineered roads, perfectly straight, 30 feet wide, that radiated from Chaco in all directions, stretching for hundreds of miles. Why, what was Chaco? Not a residential city. The great houses show evidence of only periodic occupation. Rooms were built but not lived in. Kivas were constructed but rarely used. Chaco was something else, a ceremonial center, a pilgrimage site, a place where scattered communities gathered for rituals tied to astronomical events and agricultural cycles. The architecture reveals astronomical knowledge that's breathtaking. At Pueblo Bonito, windows and doors frame the sunrise on summer and winter solstices. At Casa Rinconada, the largest kiva, light enters through a window on summer solstice morning, illuminating a specific niche. On Fajada Butte, the famous sun dagger marks equinoxes and solstices. Spirals carved into rock are bisected by daggers of light that pass through gaps between stone slabs, tracking the sun's yearly journey with precision. The Chacons were watching the sky, tracking time, recording celestial events. Construction of the great houses began around 850 AD. For 3 centuries, building continued in phases. Each generation added rooms, expanded kivas, refined the architecture. The effort was staggering. Over 200,000 trees were cut and carried to Chaco for construction. Millions of stones were shaped and placed. The labor organization required suggests a society with strong leadership and shared purpose. For centuries, building continued in phases. Each generation added rooms, expanded kivas, refined the architecture. The effort was staggering. Over 200,000 trees were cut and carried to Chaco for construction. Millions of stones were shaped and placed. The labor organization required suggests a society with strong leadership and shared purpose. But who lived here? Excavations show surprisingly few domestic artifacts, few cooking pots, few grinding stones, little evidence of daily life. Instead, they find ritual objects, turquoise by the thousands, beads, pendants, inlays, macaw feathers from Mexico over 1,000 miles south, shells from the Pacific coast, copper bells, ceremonial vessels. Chaco was importing luxury goods from across the Southwest and beyond, not for daily use, but for ritual and ceremony. The roads are perhaps the most mysterious feature. Over 400 miles of roads have been identified, many visible only from the air or through remote sensing. They're perfectly straight, running over hills and through arroyos rather than following the easiest path. These weren't practical transportation routes. You can't drive a cart up and down these slopes. They seem to have been ceremonial pathways, roads for ritual processions, for pilgrimages, for connecting outlying communities to the spiritual center. Some roads lead to other great houses built throughout the region. Others lead nowhere obvious. Some connect to astronomical features, shrine sites where celestial events could be observed. Life in Chaco during its height must have been spectacular but sporadic. For most of the year, the great houses stood largely empty. A core population of perhaps a few hundred maintained the structures, prepared for ceremonies, tracked the stars. Then came the gathering times, solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, astronomical events that happen only every 18.6 years. Pilgrims would arrive from across the region, following the roads to Chaco. They brought offerings. They brought food for feasts. They came to participate in ceremonies that connected their communities to cosmic order. In the great kivas, dozens could gather. Fires burned in central hearths. The smoke hole in the roof framed the night sky. Priests led rituals passed down through generations, chants, dances, prayers that ensured the sun would return after winter, that rain would fall in season, that crops would grow. The turquoise and other precious materials were offerings to the spirits, to the ancestors, to the forces that governed the world. For 3 centuries, this system worked. Chaco was the spiritual and ceremonial heart of a culture that stretched across tens of thousands of square miles. And then it ended. Around 1140 AD, construction at Chaco ceased. By 1150, the great houses were abandoned. The pilgrims stopped coming. The roads fell silent. Why? Drought again. Tree-ring data shows a severe 50-year drought beginning in 1130. In a region already marginal for agriculture, this was catastrophic. But Chaco wasn't primarily agricultural. The drought's impact was indirect. Scattered communities that supported Chaco couldn't sustain themselves. They moved, dispersed. The network that fed Chaco dissolved. Without pilgrims, without offerings, without the communities that gave Chaco meaning, the ceremonial center became pointless. There may have been social factors too. Evidence of violence appears in the archaeological record from this period. Not massive warfare, but raids, small-scale conflicts, social stress and breakdown. The people left, the great houses emptied, the precise masonry walls weathered but didn't fall. For centuries, Chaco stood abandoned. The roads faded, sand drifted into kivas, walls slowly eroded. Navajo people, who moved into the region later, avoided the ruins. They considered them haunted places of the ancient enemies, dangerous and best left alone. Spanish explorers in the 1700s reported ruins but didn't investigate. American explorers in the 1800s noted them. Not until the early 1900s did systematic archaeology begin. What researchers found challenged assumptions about primitive, pre-Columbian cultures. This wasn't simple village life. This was sophisticated architecture, complex social organization, advanced astronomical knowledge. Today, Chaco Canyon is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a national park. You can walk through Pueblo Bonito, stand in the Great Kivas, follow segments of the ancient roads. But go at night. That's when Chaco reveals itself. Away from city lights, the Milky Way blazes overhead with stunning clarity. The same stars the Chacons watched, the same celestial patterns they tracked. Stand in the plaza at Pueblo Bonito under that sky and imagine the pilgrims gathered. The fires burning in the kivas, the chants rising into the darkness. The sense of being connected to something vast, to the cosmos, to the cycles of time, to forces beyond human control. Chaco reminds us that not all cities are about economics or defense. Some are about meaning, about creating sacred space, about bringing scattered people together for purposes that transcend daily survival. It reminds us that astronomical knowledge isn't modern, that ancient peoples studied the sky with sophistication we're only beginning to understand. And it reminds us that even spiritual centers are vulnerable, that when environmental conditions change, when social networks break, even the most sacred places can be abandoned. The roads remain, faintly visible in satellite images. The great houses stand, their walls defying time, and the stars wheel overhead, indifferent, eternal, still tracking the patterns the Chacons once followed. As desert wind whispers across the canyon and starlight illuminates ancient walls, we leave the American Southwest and travel across the Pacific, toward another civilization that built with stone and aligned with stars, toward islands where no stone should exist, toward Nan Madol. Chapter 26, Nan Madol, Pacific Stone, Venice. On the eastern shore of Pompeii in Micronesia, 92 artificial islands rise from a shallow lagoon. Not islands of earth, but islands of stone, massive basalt logs stacked like Lincoln logs, creating walls, platforms, and tunnels. It's called the Venice of the Pacific, but Venice is built on natural islands. Nan Madol's islands were created, stone by stone, over centuries. And here's the impossible part. Pompeii has no naturally occurring basalt in workable form. The builders quarried the stone from a site across the island, then transported logs weighing several tons across the water to the construction site. No wheels, no metal tools, no draft animals, just human ingenuity and staggering effort. Between 1200 and 1600 AD, the Saudeleur dynasty ruled Pompeii from Nan Madol. They built this stone city as their capital, a place separate from the common people, accessible only by boat, defensible and sacred. The city covers over 170 acres. The artificial islands served different functions. Some were residential for ruling families. Some were administrative for governing. Some were ceremonial for rituals. Some were tombs for honored dead. The most impressive structure is Nan Dawas, the mouth of the High Chief, a massive compound with walls 40 feet high and 17 feet thick. It served as a royal mortuary, housing the tombs of the Saudeleur rulers. Walking through Nan Dawas today feels surreal. The basalt columns are stacked horizontally, creating walls that look like petrified forests laid on their sides. Mangrove roots now penetrate the walls. Fish swim through flooded corridors. But the engineering is still impressive. The walls have stood for centuries despite tropical storms, earthquakes, and the constant assault of salt water. Life in Nan Madol during its height was hierarchical. The Saudeleur dynasty ruled with absolute authority. They were considered semi-divine, descended from gods who came from the sky. Only the elite lived in Nan Madol, priests, nobles, warriors, craftsmen who served the rulers. The common people lived on Pompeii's main island and brought tribute, food, goods, labor. The separation was intentional. By living apart, surrounded by water, the Saudeleur reinforced their special status. They weren't like common people. They were closer to the gods. Daily life in the stone city revolved around ritual and ceremony. Priests performed rites to honor ancestors and gods. They made offerings of food and kava, a mildly narcotic drink made from pepper plant roots. In ceremonial complexes, drums beat for hours during festivals. Dancers performed in elaborate costumes. The elite gathered to witness rituals that maintained cosmic order and ensured prosperity. But there was darkness too. The Saudeleur dynasty grew increasingly oppressive. They demanded more tribute, more labor, more obedience. They controlled access to the sea. Fishing required permission. Certain fish were reserved for the elite. Violating these taboos meant death. The common people grew resentful. They whispered in their villages. They remembered stories of older, freer times. Around 1500 AD, a warrior named Isoklekel arrived from Kasri, another island. Whether he was invited by dissidents or came as a conqueror, legend varies, but he challenged the Saudeleur dynasty. In battle, Isoklekel defeated the Saudeleur. The last king fled or was killed. The dynasty ended. Isoklekel established a new ruling system, the non-Morki system, less centralized, more distributed among clans. He kept Nan Madol as a sacred and ceremonial site, but moved the main population back to Pompeii proper. Nan Madol began its slow decline. Some islands continued to be used for ceremonies. Some housed caretaker families, but the grandeur faded. By the time European explorers arrived in the 1800s, Nan Madol was largely abandoned. Vegetation grew through the ruins. The basalt columns, once carefully maintained, began to crack and shift. Local people still avoided it. They considered it haunted, a place where spirits of the old rulers lingered, angry and dangerous. Stories told of people who entered Nan Madol at night and never returned. Today, Nan Madol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though one classified as in danger due to erosion, climate change, and lack of resources for proper maintenance. You can visit by boat from Pompeii. Local guides will take you through the ruins, pointing out different islands, explaining functions, sharing legends. But the guides won't stay after dark. The old beliefs persist. This is a place of power, and power can be dangerous. Walking through Nan Madol is like moving through a stone maze. Corridors twist between walls. Chambers open unexpectedly. The tide comes in and out, flooding lower levels, draining them again. You see the labor invested, each basalt log placed by hand, each wall built without mortar, relying only on weight and friction to hold. Each island created from nothing, built up from the lagoon floor. And you wonder, why here? Why build in the water instead of on land? Why make it so difficult? Perhaps because difficulty was the point. Perhaps the Saudeleur wanted to demonstrate power, to show they could do what seemed impossible, to prove they were different from common mortals. Or perhaps water held spiritual significance, separation from land, surrounded by the element that gives life, closer to the ocean deities. We don't fully know. The Saudeleur left no written records, only stone and legends and the odd whispers of people who still remember. Nan Madol reminds us that monumental architecture appears in unexpected places. We think of pyramids in Egypt, temples in Rome. But here, on a tiny Pacific island, people built a stone city that rivals anything in the ancient world for ambition and engineering. It reminds us that power built on oppression eventually falls. The Saudeleur dynasty seemed untouchable, but resentment accumulated until someone challenged them and they collapsed. And it reminds us that the ocean is rising. Nan Madol is threatened not by invaders or rebellion, but by climate change. Higher seas, stronger storms. The same water that the city was built in may be what finally destroys it.